The northern wind carried blood on the night they came for him. Duke Cedric Ashford stood alone in the center of the great hall at Thorngate Manor, while 27 lords formed a semicircle of judgment around him. Torchlight painted violent shadows across their faces as they read the charges aloud. Cruelty beyond reason, territories ruled through terror, a reign so absolute it threatened the stability of the crown itself. They had arrived with royal warrants and armed escorts, convinced their numbers would be enough to strip him of everything he had built. But as Cedric listened to their accusations in complete silence, his pale gray eyes reflected nothing except the kind of cold contempt reserved for men who mistake bureaucracy for power. The hall smelled of wet stone and dying fires. Outside, storm clouds gathered over cliffs that had witnessed generations of Ashford dominance, and the sea below crashed against rocks that would still be standing long after these fools turned to dust. 27 lords thought they had cornered a tyrant. They had no idea they were staring at something far more dangerous, a man who had already decided which of them would die first. And if you want to understand how empires truly fall, and why some monsters refuse to break even when the entire world demands their destruction, stay with me until the shadows swallow the last torch. Because this story ends where most fairy tales fear to begin. 3 days before the tribunal, Cedric had been standing in the northern watchtower of Thorngate when his steward Marcus delivered the first warning. The older man climbed the spiral staircase with the careful exhaustion of someone who had served the Ashford bloodline through 3 generations of calculated brutality. His weathered face carried news that would have sent other nobles scrambling for alliances or escape routes. Cedric did not look up from the territory map spread across the stone table. His fingers traced supply routes through mountain passes while Marcus waited in silence. Understanding that interruption before acknowledgement was the fastest path to permanent dismissal. Finally, without lifting his gaze, Cedric spoke. "What?" Marcus cleared his throat. "The Southern Alliance has petitioned the crown. 27 signatures. They are calling for your removal from the Northern Command." Cedric's hand stilled above the parchment. "Which families?" "All of them, Your Grace. Halbrecht, Montrose, Thorn, the River Lords, even House Kellen, they claim your governance has become unstable, that you rule through fear rather than law." A sound escaped Cedric's throat that might have been laughter in a different man. In him it resembled something closer to contempt finding its voice. He straightened from the maps and finally turned to face his steward. The lamplight caught the sharp angles of his face, all brutal aristocratic lines carved from the same stone as the fortress itself. His black coat hung open over a simple linen shirt, and there was mud on his boots from the morning patrol through the northern villages. He looked nothing like the perfumed nobility who spent their days plotting in carpeted throne rooms. He looked like a predator interrupted during a kill. "They think I rule through fear," Cedric said quietly. His voice carried the kind of measured calm that preceded violence. "What do they imagine law is, Marcus? What do they believe holds their precious kingdoms together while they sleep in silk beds behind locked doors?" Marcus said nothing. 40 years in service had taught him when speech was required and when survival demanded silence. Cedric moved to the window. Below, the northern territories stretched toward a horizon where gray sky met darker sea. Villages dotted the landscape like scattered chess pieces, each one secured through methods the southern lords found distasteful. Taxes collected on time, roads maintained, bandits eliminated with such thorough efficiency that crime had become a memory rather than a threat. The people feared him. They also ate regularly, which was more than most territories could claim. "When does the tribunal convene?" Cedric asked. 3 days. They will come here with royal authority. If I resist. Cedric's reflection in the window glass showed teeth. "The question is not whether I will resist, Marcus. The question is whether they understand what they have actually done by coming to my territory with papers and expectations." "Your Grace." Marcus took a half step forward, then thought better of it. "If you act against a royal decree, the crown will have no choice but to declare you an open rebellion. Everything you have built. Everything I have built exists because I understand the only language power truly speaks." Cedric turned from the window, his eyes fixed on Marcus with the kind of attention that made grown men remember childhood fears. "Do you know what happens when 27 lords unite against a single enemy, Marcus?" The steward hesitated. "They become a formidable force, Your Grace." "No, Kedrick moved back to the map table. His finger landed on a specific mountain pass marked in red ink. They become a target large enough that I do not have to aim. He traced connections between the signatures on the petition that Marcus had brought. Each name represented wealth, territory, military strength. Together, they formed a coalition that should have been overwhelming. Kedrick saw only structural weaknesses waiting to be exploited. Albrecht, he said softly, naming the lord who had likely orchestrated the alliance. His daughter married Montrose's son last spring, a political match to unite their territories. But Montrose owes the River Lords 3 years of defaulted grain contracts. He gestured to another section of the map. Thorn publicly supports the petition, but he has been quietly buying Halbrecht's land through a proxy in the capital. They smile at each other in throne rooms while their lawyers prepare for economic war. Marcus watched his master dissect the alliance with the clinical precision of a surgeon identifying exactly where to place the blade. House Kellen, Kedrick continued, is the weak point. They joined because they fear being left out, not because they want me removed. Their loyalty costs exactly as much as their paranoia weighs. He looked up. How much gold do we have in the reserve vaults? Enough to fund a small war, Your Grace. Good. Send word to Kellen, anonymous. Make it clear that certain financial records regarding their involvement in the southern smuggling routes might become public unless they reconsider their position. Nothing that cannot be denied later, but specific enough that they understand someone is watching. And the others. Kedrick's smile held no warmth whatsoever. The others will come here expecting a tribunal. They will receive exactly what they asked for. He dismissed Marcus with a gesture and returned to the maps alone. Outside, the wind picked up force as the storm finally broke over Thorngate. Rain lashed against stone walls that had weathered centuries of similar weather, similar threats, similar fools who thought proximity to the crown made them untouchable. Kedrick poured a measure of whiskey into a glass and stood at the window watching lightning illuminate his territories in brief violent flashes. Somewhere in those lands, families were sitting down to dinner in homes that remained standing because he had eliminated the chaos that would have consumed them otherwise. They did not love him for it. They did not need to. Fear was more reliable than affection, always had been. But as he drank and watched the storm, something else moved beneath the cold calculation. Something that had been growing darker since the day his father died in this very room, murdered by men who smiled during the funeral and voted for his killer's pardon afterward. The Southern Alliance thought they were deposing a cruel administrator. They had no idea they were awakening the part of him that remembered exactly what nobility looked like when it bled. The lords arrived on schedule with all the ceremony their bureaucratic minds could manufacture. 27 men in formal house colors, accompanied by royal attorneys carrying leather document cases embossed with the king's seal. They rode through Thorngate's gates at noon under banners that snapped in the wind like captured prey. The townsfolk watched from doorways and windows as the procession moved through narrow streets toward the manor, their expressions carefully neutral in that particular way. Common people learn when powerful men play games with other people's futures. Kedrick watched the arrival from the manor's eastern balcony. He wore black from collar to boot, the only ornamentation a silver chain of office that caught the weak sunlight like a slash across his throat. Marcus stood 3 paces behind, holding the formal seal of the Northern Territories and trying very hard not to look like a man watching his master prepare to commit calculated suicide. They brought more guards than expected, Marcus observed quietly. Kedrick's mouth curved. They are afraid. They should be, Your Grace. If this goes poorly, it will not go poorly. Kedrick straightened his cuffs with the methodical care of a man checking weapons before battle. It will go exactly as I have designed it. Tell Captain Brennan to have our men positioned but not visible. I want the lords to feel confident enough to speak freely. And if they attempt to arrest you, then we will all learn something interesting about the weight of royal authority this far north. Marcus departed to relay the instructions, leaving Kedrick alone with his thoughts and the sound of horses being stabled in the courtyard below. He could see Lord Halbrecht dismounting, his elaborate coat struggling against the wind. The man had put on weight since they last met, the kind of soft prosperity that came from ruling through intimidation, backed by distance rather than presence. His face carried the expression of someone who believed justice and paperwork were synonymous. Kedrick almost pitied him. Almost. The great hall had been prepared according to tradition. A long table dominated the center of the room, flanked by chairs for the visiting lords. Torches burned in iron sconces along the stone walls, despite the afternoon light filtering through high windows. The effect was deliberately medieval, a reminder that Thorngate Manor existed long before the current crown, and would likely outlast it. Caedric entered last, after the lords had settled into their seats and grown comfortable in their collective authority. He moved through the doorway without announcement or fanfare, just a tall figure in black whose presence immediately changed the temperature of the room. 27 heads turned in unison. 27 men suddenly remembered why they had needed to gather this many allies in the first place. Caedric did not take the chair at the head of the table. Instead, he remained standing at the far end of the hall, hands clasped behind his back, his posture suggesting a professor about to address particularly slow students rather than a man facing formal charges. The silence stretched until Lord Halbrecht cleared his throat and rose to his feet. Duke Ashford, we have come as representatives of the Southern Alliance and by authority of the Crown to address concerns regarding your governance of the Northern Territories. Caedric said nothing. Halbrecht glanced at the papers in front of him, then continued. Multiple reports indicate that your methods of administration have exceeded the bounds of lawful authority. Excessive taxation, cruel punishment, the disappearance of individuals who oppose your rule. They did not disappear, Caedric interrupted. His voice carried clearly across the hall despite its softness. They were executed. For crimes, under authority granted to me by the same crown you claim to represent. Be precise in your accusations, Halbrecht. Lying wastes everyone's time. A ripple of discomfort moved through the assembled lords. Halbrecht's face reddened, but he pressed forward. You admit to executing citizens without trial. I admit to enforcing laws that you and your colleagues prefer to ignore in your own territories. Caedric took 3 steps forward, his boots echoing on stone. The bandits you allowed to flourish in the river territories murdered 17 people last year before I sent troops to eliminate them. Would you prefer I had convened a committee to discuss their feelings first? That is not the point, Lord Montrose interjected from his seat. The point is accountability. Your power has grown unchecked. My power has grown proportional to my competence. Caedric's gaze swung to Montrose like a blade finding a new target. Unlike certain lords who inherit wealth and mistake it for capability, the insult landed precisely as intended. Montrose surged halfway out of his chair before Halbrecht gestured him down. The room's tension ratcheted higher, the lords beginning to understand that this would not be the civilized bureaucratic proceeding they had imagined. Duke Ashford, another voice called out. Lord Thorn, older and carrying the kind of political experience that made him dangerous. We are not here to trade insults. The charges are serious. If you cannot defend your actions, so I do not need to defend anything. Caedric stopped at the table's edge. His hands remained behind his back, relaxed, completely unthreatening except for the absolute certainty in his voice. You came here believing that 27 signatures on a petition create legitimacy, that royal seals make your fear rational. But what you actually did, gentlemen, was travel to my territory to explain to me why you believe I should care about your opinion. Halbrecht slammed a hand on the table. This is not a request, Ashford. The Crown has authorized us to strip you of your command if you cannot provide satisfactory. The Crown. Caedric laughed, short and sharp. The Crown sits in a palace 300 miles south and relies on men like me to ensure that roads remain safe enough for tax collectors to reach your estates. The crown is a symbol you hide behind when you lack the courage to act directly. He moved along the table now, speaking directly to the assembled lords with the kind of focused intensity that made each man feel personally addressed. You want to know why the Northern Territories thrive while your lands barely function. It is not mystery. It is not magic. It is simply that I am willing to do what is necessary while you waste time debating what is comfortable. When bandits raid a village, I do not form a council to study their motivations. I hunt them down and leave their bodies on display so that others understand the cost of theft. When corrupt officials skim from tax collections, I do not reassign them to different posts. I strip their wealth and cast them into the streets they exploited. You call it cruelty. I call it efficiency. That is tyranny, Lord Kellen said, his voice uncertain. We have laws. We have laws that protect the powerful and punish the desperate, Caedric corrected. Your precious legal system exists to ensure that men like you can rule badly without consequence. He stopped at the center of the table. I enforce a different code. Competence is rewarded, Betrayal is destroyed, and power belongs to those strong enough to hold it. Halbrecht stood again, his composure cracking. You speak as if you are above the crown itself. I speak as a realist. Kedrick's voice dropped lower, forcing them to lean in to hear. You came here to depose me because you fear what I represent. Not a tyrant, something worse. Proof that your version of nobility is obsolete. That honor and law and all your comfortable traditions mean nothing when measured against simple, brutal effectiveness. He turned and walked back toward the hall's entrance, each step deliberate. So here's what will happen, gentlemen. You will return to your territories and inform the Crown that the Northern Command declines to recognize this tribunal's authority. You will recommend that future concerns be addressed through proper diplomatic channels rather than theatrical delegations. And you will do this because the alternative is discovering exactly how far my reach extends into your own lands. The threat hung in the air like smoke from the torches. Lord Thorne rose slowly. You are making a grave mistake, Duke Ashford. If we return and report open defiance, then the Crown will do what it believes appropriate. Kedrick turned to face them one final time, and we will all learn whether royal authority means anything this far from the palace walls. But before you make threats, Thorne, you might want to ask Halbrecht about the irregularities in his grain contracts, or Montrose about his daughter's marriage conditions, or any of the others about the private arrangements I have spent the last 3 days investigating. The color drained from several faces simultaneously. You think I did not know this was coming? Kedrick continued. You think I did not prepare. Every one of you has something you would prefer remained hidden. Every alliance in this room exists on foundations of private compromise and mutual blackmail. So when you return south to report my defiance, remember that I also have reports to deliver. And unlike yours, mine include names, dates, and amounts. The silence that followed was absolute. Kedrick smiled. You are dismissed, gentlemen. Captain Brennan will escort you to your horses. He turned and left the hall without waiting for response, his footsteps fading up the stone staircase while 27 lords sat in stunned paralysis, each man suddenly doing frantic mental calculations about exactly how much their coalition had just cost them. Woke. Marcus found Kedrick in his private study an hour after the delegation departed in disorganized haste. The room occupied the manor's highest point, a circular chamber lined with books, maps, and letters from every corner of the kingdom. A fire burned in the grate despite the mild temperature, more for atmosphere than warmth. Kedrick stood at the window with a glass in hand, watching the southern road where dust from the Lord's departure still hung in the air. They will not forgive this, your grace. Kedrick did not turn. I did not ask for forgiveness. The Crown will have to act. If they do nothing after you publicly refused a royal tribunal, then they prove my point. Kedrick took a drink. Power without enforcement is just ceremony. If the Crown cannot compel obedience from a single northern duke, what does that say about their authority? It says you have started a war you may not be able to win. Now Kedrick did turn, his expression unreadable in the firelight. Who said anything about winning? Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. Your Grace, please, think about what you are doing. The Northern Territories need you. The people will survive, Kedrick interrupted. They always do. Leaders change, but the land remains. He moved to the desk and set down his glass. The question is not whether I can win a conflict with the Crown, Marcus. The question is whether I can demonstrate that their version of order is built on such weak foundations that one defiant duke can collapse it entirely. That is madness. Perhaps. Kedrick's hand rested on a sealed letter atop a stack of correspondence. But madness honestly performed is still more authentic than sanity maintained through cowardice. Marcus stared at his master, seeing clearly for the first time how far Kedrick had drifted from the young nobleman who inherited these territories 15 years ago. Back then, there had still been something salvageable in him. Some capacity for compromise, for alliance, for the small human connections that kept men from becoming the myths they enforced. Now there was only the myth, and the man had disappeared somewhere beneath it. What is in that letter? Marcus asked quietly. Kedrick picked up the envelope, weighing it. Information, the kind that will ensure the Southern Alliance tears itself apart from within long before the Crown can organize a unified response against me. You're going to destroy them. I am going to let them destroy each other. Kedrick broke the seal and scanned the contents. The letter contained detailed financial records of Lord Halbrecht's involvement in illegal silver mining operations that had been undercutting Crown monopolies for 3 years. Proof that would not only disgrace him, but implicate half the Southern Alliance in either direct participation or willful ignorance. One letter to the right people, and the coalition would collapse into accusations and counter-accusations, while Caedric remained untouched in his northern fortress. This is not justice, Your Grace. This is revenge. Revenge implies personal grievance. Caedric set the letter aside. This is simply removing threats before they fully form. If you see a storm gathering, you do not wait for it to strike. You act while you still control the timing. And what happens when there are no more threats to remove? Marcus moved closer. When every potential enemy has been eliminated or cowed. What then, Your Grace? Who will you be when there is no one left to fight? The question struck something beneath Caedric's armor, some fragment of awareness that he could not quite suppress. For a moment, the mask slipped and Marcus saw the exhaustion underneath. The bone-deep weariness of a man who had spent so long being the monster his territories needed that he could no longer remember what it felt like to be anything else. Then the mask returned and Caedric spoke with the same cold certainty. Then I will finally be able to rest. Marcus understood in that moment that his master was not seeking victory. He was seeking an end, any end, even one that required burning down everything he had built just to see if the flames could still make him feel something other than the hollow satisfaction of accumulated power. The old steward bowed slightly and left the study without another word. Some battles could not be won through loyalty or reason. Some men were too far gone to be pulled back from the edge they had chosen. All you could do was bear witness and hope the destruction would at least mean something when the ashes finally settled. 3 hours later, a rider arrived at Thorngate's gates, not from the south, where the disgraced lords were currently fleeing toward their fractured alliance. From the east, through the mountain passes that connected the northern territories to the coastal provinces beyond the crown's direct influence. Captain Brennan brought the woman to Caedric's study personally, which meant she was either dangerous or important, possibly both. She stood in the doorway with travel dust on her cloak, and the kind of controlled exhaustion that came from riding hard through difficult terrain. Her face was striking rather than beautiful, all sharp angles and intense dark eyes that assessed the room with professional efficiency before focusing entirely on Caedric. Duke Ashford, she said without preamble. My name is Elena Thane. I represent interests in the coastal provinces who have been watching your situation with considerable attention. Caedric gestured Brennan away and closed the study door. He did not offer the woman a chair. Who sent you? People who believe the crown has grown too comfortable in its authority. Elena removed her gloves with precise movements. People who think a demonstration of resistance might benefit everyone who currently suffers under centralized incompetence. You represent rebels. I represent pragmatists. She met his gaze without flinching. There is a difference. Rebels fight for ideology. We fight for regional autonomy and economic freedom from a capital that has forgotten what happens outside throne room walls. Caedric poured 2 glasses of whiskey and held one out. The woman accepted it but did not drink, merely studied the amber liquid as if checking for poison. Smart woman. Why would coastal merchants care about a northern duke's defiance? Caedric asked. Because defiance in one territory creates opportunity in others. Elena finally took a sip. If you successfully resist the crown's authority, you establish precedent. If precedent exists, law becomes negotiable rather than absolute. And if law is negotiable, then trade agreements, tax structures, and military obligations all become subject to regional interpretation rather than royal decree. You want me to start a revolution? We want you to continue doing exactly what you are already doing. She set down the glass. The only difference is that instead of standing alone against the entire weight of the crown, you would have resources, intelligence, and strategic support from people who understand that empires only maintain power because everyone agrees to pretend they are invincible. Caedric walked to the window. Below, Thorngate's courtyards were settling into evening routines. Guards changing shifts, servants lighting lamps. The ordinary machinery of governance continuing regardless of the philosophical wars being waged in tower studies. What do your pragmatists want in return? He asked. Elena joined him in the window. Her reflection in the glass showed a slight smile. Proof that it can be done. One lord, one territory, successfully maintaining independence while the crown watches and does nothing. That is all. We are not asking you to march on the capital or declare open warfare. Just hold your ground. And when they send armies instead of attorneys, then you defend yourself. Her smile widened. and we ensure that certain supply routes remain open. That information about troop movements arrives in time to be useful. That the bureaucratic machinery of empire suddenly develops inexplicable delays whenever it tries to move against you. You would make me a symbol. You are already a symbol, Duke Ashford. The woman's voice softened slightly. The question is whether you want to be a symbol that burns brightly and dies alone, or one that lights fires across every territory that has suffered under incompetent nobility and distant justice. Cadric turned to face her fully. His pale eyes searched her face for deception or manipulation, finding only the hard pragmatism of someone who had thought through all the angles before making this approach. If I agree to this alliance, certain things need to be understood. His voice dropped to the dangerous quiet that preceded violence. I do not take orders. I do not compromise my methods, and I will eliminate any partner who becomes a liability faster than I would an enemy. Is that clear? Perfectly. Elena extended her hand. We would expect nothing less. They shook on it, the grip firm and brief. A transaction rather than a bond. Cadric appreciated the honesty of it. How many territories are involved in your network? He asked. Enough that if we act in coordination, the crown would face simultaneous resistance across half the kingdom. Elena collected her gloves. But coordination requires communication and trust, which is why I am here delivering this message in person rather than through intermediaries. And your next step? I return east and inform my associates that the northern territories are formally aligned with regional autonomy interests. You continue governing as you see fit and resist any crown attempts at interference. When the time comes for broader action, you will receive word through secure channels. Cadric walked her to the study door. One more question. She paused in the doorway. Yes. Why me specifically? There are other lords who hate the crown, other territories that would welcome independence. Why approach a duke known primarily for cruelty rather than ideology? Elena's smile turned genuinely amused. Because ideology makes men predictable, Duke Ashford. It gives them boundaries and moral lines they will not cross. She pulled on her gloves. You have no ideology. You have only method and will. And that makes you the most dangerous kind of ally. One who cannot be controlled by appealing to principles he does not hold. Your cruelty is your strength because it proves you are willing to do what others merely threaten. She left before he could respond, her footsteps fading down the tower stairs. Cadric stood in the doorway for a long moment, processing what had just occurred. In the span of one day, he had defied the crown, threatened the most powerful lords in the southern territories, and formed an alliance with a network of regional separatists. Any reasonable man would be terrified by the forces he had just set in motion. Cadric felt nothing except a distant curiosity about how far he could push before something finally broke. He returned to his desk and composed 3 letters. The first went to Lord Halbrecht, containing just enough information from the sealed documents to make the man understand exactly how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered. The second went to a contact in the capital, purchasing information about crown military movements and political discussions. The third went to his own captains, with orders to begin fortifying Thorngate's defenses and recruiting additional forces from the mountain clans who had always existed just outside royal authority. By midnight, all 3 letters were dispatched with riders who understood that failure to deliver meant permanent disappearance. Cadric finally allowed himself to sleep. The rest came in brief fragments interrupted by dreams of burning cities and the sound of his father's last breath rattling in the darkness. He woke at dawn to find frost on the windows and blood under his fingernails, where he had apparently been clawing at something during the night. In the mirror above his wash basin, he barely recognized the face staring back. It looked like his father, all cold eyes and sharp edges, worn smooth by years of necessary violence. The kind of face that appeared in children's nightmares when they misbehaved. Cadric splashed cold water across his features and dressed for another day of governance. Below, the territories waited for his decisions, his justice, his ruthless administration of order. They feared him. They should. But as he descended from his chambers toward the great hall where petitioners and problems already gathered, one thought followed him like shadow at noon. If this is what victory looks like, why does it feel so much like slow decay? The answer arrived 7 days later with news from the south that Lord Halbrecht had been found dead in his chambers under circumstances the royal investigators were calling suspicious. And with that death, Everything Caedric had carefully set in motion began to accelerate toward consequences even he had not fully calculated. The body arrived as Thorngate 3 days after the murder, not as a corpse, but as a political weapon wrapped in royal seals and accusations. Lord Halbrecht's death had transformed overnight from a private tragedy into a public crisis, and the Crown wasted no time weaponizing it. The official report claimed poison administered by an unknown party with connections to Northern interest. Translation: Caedric had ordered the execution of a sitting lord on sovereign territory, and the kingdom would no longer tolerate his existence outside their control. Marcus delivered the news in the study where Caedric had been reviewing grain shipments from the eastern provinces. The old steward's hands shook slightly as he held out the parchment bearing the royal investigation seal. They are calling it assassination, Your Grace. Premeditated murder of a peer during active tribunal proceedings. Caedric read the document in silence. His face revealed nothing, but something shifted in the quality of stillness surrounding him. Like watching ice form across deep water, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Did we kill him? Marcus hesitated. No, Your Grace. Our people had no contact with Halbrecht after he left Thorngate. He died in his own bed 300 miles south. Then someone else wanted him dead and saw an opportunity to blame the convenient monster. Caedric set down the parchment with deliberate care. The question is who benefits most from my guilt? The entire Southern Alliance, Marcus said quietly. With you accused of murdering their leader, they have justification for united military action. The Crown cannot appear weak by ignoring a lord's assassination. You have been maneuvered into a position where defense looks like admission. Caedric stood and moved to the window. Outside, morning light painted Thorngate's courtyards in shades of gray and gold. Servants moved through their routines, unaware that the world was collapsing around their master's carefully constructed authority. He could see Captain Brennan drilling troops in the lower bailey, their formations precise despite the early hour. Good men preparing for a war their commander had accidentally orchestrated. How long before they come? Caedric asked. The Crown is mobilizing forces now. Marcus stepped closer. 2 weeks, perhaps 3, if weather slows their march. But Your Grace, they will not come with tribunals this time. They will come with siege engines and enough soldiers to ensure you cannot refuse. Then we have 2 weeks to decide whether we survive this or simply make them regret the attempt. There must be another way. Marcus's voice carried desperation now. If you went to the capital personally, stood before the king and demonstrated your innocence. I am many things, Marcus, but I am not innocent. Caedric turned from the window. Not of what they are accusing me, perhaps. But innocent? No. I have done everything they fear and worse. The only difference is I did it efficiently while they did it with prettier language. So you will fight. I will do what I have always done. Caedric returned to his desk and began pulling specific documents from locked drawers. I will turn their weapon against them until they understand that hunting monsters requires more courage than signing papers. What are you planning? Caedric looked up, and for just a moment Marcus saw past the cold calculation to something rawer underneath. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to resignation, mixed with the kind of dark curiosity that came from a man who had stopped caring about his own survival. I am going to prove that power without the will to enforce it is just expensive decoration, and I am going to make them watch while I do it. The first message went out that afternoon through channels Elena Thane had provided during her visit. Short, encrypted, designed to activate the network of regional interests who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The Crown moves against Thorngate. Respond as discussed. Within hours, coordinated chaos erupted across 5 territories simultaneously. Trade routes in the river provinces suddenly developed inexplicable delays as dock workers discovered urgent safety concerns about Crown requisitioned ships. Tax collectors in the eastern mountain passes found themselves stranded when local guides mysteriously became unavailable. Supply caravans heading toward the capital encountered bandit raids that targeted only royal goods while leaving private merchants untouched. None of it was overtly rebellious. Each incident existed in the gray space between accident and sabotage. Impossible to prove, but impossible to ignore. The machinery of empire that had run smoothly for generations began developing friction in a dozen small places simultaneously. And at the center of it all sat Caedric Ashford, who had just demonstrated that he could reach anywhere the Crown's authority claimed to extend. The second message went directly to the king, delivered by a rider who wore no house colors and carried papers that would burn after reading. Your Majesty, I did not kill Lord Halbrecht, but I understand why you must act as though I did. Perception often matters more than truth when managing an empire built on the illusion of absolute authority. However, before you commit forces to a northern siege, consider what message you send by moving an army against one duke while leaving the actual murderer unpunished. Someone wanted Halbrecht dead and wanted me blamed. That person is currently celebrating while you do exactly what they predicted. I will not surrender. I will not flee. But I'm willing to discuss terms that allow both of us to walk away from this with our authority intact. The choice, as always, belongs to those brave enough to make it. Cedric Ashford, Duke of the Northern Territories. The letter was a masterpiece of calculated provocation. It acknowledged the king's position without conceding guilt, offered negotiation while making clear that force would be resisted, and most importantly, planted doubt about who actually benefited from Halbrecht's convenient death. Marcus read it before dispatch and felt something close to admiration mixed with horror. This will either save you or guarantee they execute you publicly, Your Grace. Then we will know soon enough which kind of king we serve. Cedric sealed the letter with his personal signet, the kind who values actual justice, or the kind who values the appearance of strength more than truth. And if it is the latter, then at least we will have forced him to reveal it. 4 days passed in tense preparation. Thorngate transformed from an administrative center into a fortress actively expecting siege. Brennan's soldiers reinforced walls, stockpiled weapons, drilled constantly in the courtyards. Supply masters inventoried food stores and water sources. Engineers inspected every gate and portcullis for weaknesses that needed addressing before armies arrived. Cedric moved through it all with the focused calm of a man who had already accepted every possible outcome. He met with his officers, reviewed defensive strategies, made decisions about civilian evacuations from surrounding villages. His instructions were precise, methodical, completely lacking in the theatrical defiance that usually accompanied doomed last stands. This was not Cedric preparing to die gloriously. This was a predator choosing its hunting ground. On the 5th day, Elena Thane returned with 3 riders and news from the eastern provinces. They met in the Great Hall after sunset, the room lit by torches that cast jumping shadows across stone walls. Elena looked harder than during her first visit, the kind of weathered intensity that came from living through the early stages of something that might become history, or might just become another failed uprising. "The coastal cities are with you," she said without preamble. "Officially neutral, but our networks are prepared to escalate disruption if the Crown commits to siege." She gestured to her companions. "This is Garrett from the river provinces and Sienna from the mountain territories. They represent similar interests." Cedric studied the newcomers with the assessment of someone evaluating weapons before battle. Garrett was broad-shouldered and carried himself like former military, probably a soldier who had grown disillusioned with Crown service. Sienna was smaller, quieter, but her eyes held the sharp calculation of someone who survived by reading threats faster than others, noticed them. "You understand what you are committing to," Cedric said. "If this escalates beyond sabotage, the Crown will hunt you with the same resources they are gathering for me." "We know," Garrett replied. His voice carried the rough accent of someone who had spent more time in camps than courts. "Been hunting us anyway, just slower. You gave us reason to stop hiding." Sienna leaned forward. "The question is whether you can hold long enough for our actions to matter. If Thorngate falls in the first week, everything we have built collapses with it." Cedric walked to the hall's center where a large map of the Northern Territories lay spread across the table. His finger traced the approaches an army would need to take to reach Thorngate effectively. "They will come from the south through the Valley Pass," he said. "It is the only route that allows siege equipment and supply wagons. The mountain approaches are too narrow, the coastal cliffs too dangerous." He tapped a specific point, "which means they will need to establish a forward camp here, roughly 3 days' march from Thorngate itself." "And that is where we hit them," Elena said, understanding immediately. "No." Cedric's finger moved to a different location. "That is where we make them think we will hit them." He traced a secondary route. "The actual strike comes here, cutting their supply line after they have committed to the valley. Let them reach Thorngate. Let them begin siege preparations. Then we demonstrate that defending a fortress is very different from maintaining supply routes through hostile territory." Garrett grinned a wolf's expression. You want them trapped between Thorngate's walls and territories they can no longer control. I want them to understand that the North is not a place you conquer. It is a place that swallows armies and returns nothing but stories about why hubris has consequences. Kadric looked up at his new allies. Your networks harass their supply chains. My forces defend the fortress. And together we teach the crown that some territories cost more than they are worth. The three visitors exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. There is one problem with this strategy, Sienna said carefully. It requires you to endure the initial siege alone while we organize disruption efforts. Weeks, potentially, with armies surrounding you and no visible support. The northern villages will think you have been abandoned. Your own people might lose faith. Then I will give them something more reliable than faith. Kedric's voice carried absolute certainty. I will give them survival. Every day Thorngate stands, every supply convoy that fails to reach the siege, every message that arrives showing coordinated resistance across multiple territories. People do not need to believe in you. They just need to see that opposing you costs more than tolerating your rule. Marcus had been standing quietly near the hall's entrance, listening to his master architect a defensive war that would likely kill thousands and destabilize half the kingdom. Now he stepped forward. Your Grace, perhaps we should discuss— No. Kedric cut him off with a gesture. The time for discussion ended when they decided to blame me for a murder I did not commit. Now we discover whether their version of justice can survive contact with someone who refuses to play by rules designed to protect incompetence. The old steward fell silent, recognizing the futility of argument. His master had crossed into territory where reason no longer applied, where the only language spoken was power, and the only currency accepted was will. Elena pulled a sealed document from her coat. From our people in the capital. Intelligence about troop movements, supply routes, officer rosters. Everything we could gather before leaving. Kadric accepted it without reading. This comes with expectations. Of course! Elena's smile held no warmth. You hold Thorngate. We disrupt their operations. And when this is over, we all get to negotiate new arrangements with a crown that has learned it cannot simply dictate terms to territories it does not actually control. And if the crown wins, then we all hang together and at least die having tried. Garrett shrugged. Not the worst outcome for people who are already living under incompetent authority. Kaedric looked at each of them in turn, these strangers who had committed treason based on nothing more than the belief that his particular brand of ruthlessness might succeed where their previous caution had failed. Then we understand each other. He rolled up the map. Go back to your territories, coordinate with your networks. Wait for my signal before escalating beyond current harassment levels. And remember that if any of you betray this alliance, I will make surviving crown justice look merciful by comparison. It was not a threat. Just a statement of operational reality delivered in the same tone someone might use to discuss weather patterns. The three visitors departed shortly after, melting back into the night toward wherever rebels hid when they were not actively committing treason. Kaedric stood alone in the great hall, surrounded by maps and torchlight, feeling the weight of what he had just committed to. Not just his own survival, but the survival of every person in Thorngate and the surrounding territories. Every soldier who would fight. Every villager who would starve if the siege lasted too long. Every family that would lose fathers and sons and brothers to violence that existed because one duke refused to bend. The smart choice would be to flee. Disappear into the mountain territories where crown authority had never fully reached. Live out his life as an exile with wealth enough to buy comfort, if not power. But comfort had never been the point. Power had never really been the point either. The point, if Kaedric was honest with himself in the empty hall, was discovering whether anything he built could outlast the moment when the entire weight of established authority tried to crush it. He extinguished the torches one by one and climbed to his study, where letters from across the kingdom waited for responses that might never be written. The reply from the king arrived 6 days after Kaedric's message, delivered by a royal herald accompanied by 20 armed guards who clearly expected to be attacked the moment they crossed into northern territory. No one touched them. Kaedric had given specific instructions that crown representatives were to be treated with flawless courtesy right up until the moment violence became necessary. The herald was given food, water, a place to rest, and an audience in the great hall within an hour of arrival. He was a young man, maybe 25, clearly chosen because he was expendable rather than experienced. His hands shook slightly as he unrolled the official proclamation, though whether from fear or cold, Cedric could not tell. By order of His Majesty King Edmund III, the herald began, his voice carefully formal. Duke Cedric Ashford of the Northern Territories is hereby summoned to answer charges of murder, conspiracy, and treason against the crown. You are ordered to surrender yourself and your command to royal authority within 10 days. Failure to comply will result in military action to secure your arrest and the annexation of Northern Territories under direct crown administration. The herald finished reading and stood waiting for response while guards lined the walls and Thorngate's entire court watched in silence. Cedric remained seated in his chair at the hall's far end, casual to the point of insult. He let the silence stretch until the young herald's composure began cracking at the edges. Finally, he spoke. 10 days. His voice carried clearly despite its softness. That is actually more generous than I expected. Tell His Majesty I appreciate the courtesy of a deadline. Then you will surrender. The herald tried for hope and achieved only uncertainty. No. Cedric stood and walked forward with the unhurried confidence of a man in his own territory addressing a trespasser. I will do what anyone falsely accused should do. I will defend myself and wait for actual evidence rather than political convenience. The charges are supported by timing and opportunity, not proof. Cedric stopped 3 paces from the herald. Lord Halbrecht died in his own territory, poisoned by someone with access to his private chambers. I was 300 miles away with hundreds of witnesses. So either I have magical powers your investigators somehow missed, or someone is using his death as an excuse to eliminate a duke they find inconvenient. The king believes the king believes what his advisors tell him to believe, and his advisors have their own reasons for wanting me removed. Cedric circled the herald slowly, a predator examining prey. Do you know what happens to men who carry out unjust orders, Herald? They end up in history books as cautionary tales about the difference between following law and enforcing injustice. The young man swallowed hard. I am just delivering the message, Your Grace. I know, and you will return alive with my response, which is more mercy than your king is offering me. Cedric stopped circling. Tell His Majesty that I will not surrender. Tell him that if he wants Thorngate, he will have to take it with blood and discover exactly how much his crown authority costs when measured against northern resolve. And tell him that every day his armies spend besieging one duke is another day the entire kingdom watches. Him commit resources to crushing dissent rather than addressing the corruption that made dissent necessary. That is treason, the herald whispered. That is honesty. Cedric gestured toward the hall's entrance. You are dismissed. Captain Brennan will escort you safely to the southern border. I suggest you ride quickly because the window for safe passage closes the moment your king's armies enter my territories. The herald fled with his guards, practically running from the hall. Cedric watched them go, then turned to address his own people who had witnessed the exchange. In 10 days, armies will arrive at our gates. They will come with siege towers and catapults and the weight of royal authority. They will expect us to break under pressure, to surrender when faced with overwhelming force. His voice rose slightly, carrying to every corner of the hall. I am not ordering any of you to stay. If you want to leave, go now. Take your family south or east or anywhere you believe will be safer than Thorngate under siege. I will think no less of you for choosing survival. No one moved. Cedric felt something unexpected tighten in his chest. Not quite emotion, more like recognition that his brutality had somehow earned loyalty beyond what fear alone could command. Captain Brennan stepped forward. We stand with you, Your Grace. Right or wrong, we stand. Cedric nodded once, not trusting his voice for a moment. Then prepare for siege. Double the wall guards. Finish stockpiling supplies. Send riders to evacuate any villages within 3 days' march of Thorngate. I want civilians cleared from areas that will become battlegrounds. The hall emptied as people moved to execute his orders, leaving Cedric alone with Marcus once again. They will come with everything they have, the old steward said quietly. I know. And we might not survive it. I know that too. Marcus studied his master's profile in the afternoon light filtering through high windows. Then why not flee, Your Grace? You have allies who would shelter you, resources to live comfortably in exile. Why die here for a title and territory you claim not to care about? Kadric was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something unfamiliar, something almost honest. Because if I run, it proves they were right. That power without legitimacy collapses the moment it faces real resistance. But if I stand, if I force them to destroy me publicly while the entire kingdom watches, then everyone learns a different lesson. He turned to face Marcus. They learned that authority maintained through fear of one man is not authority at all. Just theater that ends the moment someone refuses their lines. That is not survival, Your Grace. That is philosophy. Perhaps. Kadric's mouth curved without humor. But I have spent 15 years surviving, Marcus, and every morning I wake up emptier than the day before. Maybe it is time to discover if standing for something, even something as simple as refusing false charges, feels different than just existing in the spaces between other people's fears. The old steward saw clearly then that his master had already made peace with death, not seeking it actively, but no longer running from it either, just walking steadily toward whatever end came while maintaining the same cold calculation that had defined his entire rule. It was the saddest thing Marcus had ever witnessed. The armies arrived on schedule, exactly 10 days after the ultimatum. 5,000 soldiers bearing royal standards, siege equipment that took 2 days to position, supply trains stretching back toward the horizon. They established camp 3 miles south of Thorngate, in the valley Kaedric had predicted, transforming open farmland into a military city practically overnight. From Thorngate's highest tower, Kaedric watched the preparations through a spyglass, while Brennan reported numbers and equipment inventories. They brought enough provisions for a 6-month siege. 3 catapults, 2 siege towers, battering rams reinforced with iron. The commander is Lord General Aldrich. Veteran of the Northern Wars, he knows siegecraft. Then this will be interesting. Kedrick lowered the spyglass. What about our own numbers? 700 soldiers, another 300 militia from surrounding territories. Walls are reinforced, gates secured, supplies stockpiled for 4 months if we ration carefully. Brennan paused. We are outnumbered 7-1, Your Grace. I can count. Kadric handed him the spyglass. But numbers matter less behind walls. They need to break us. We just need to not break. Very different calculations. And when the walls fall, if the walls fall, we make them regret every inch they take. Kadric descended from the tower toward the courtyard where his officers waited for final instructions. This is not about winning, Brennan. This is about making victory cost more than they are willing to pay. The siege began the next morning with a formal offer of surrender that Kaedric refused from the walls in view of both armies. Lord General Aldrich, a gray-haired veteran with scars from actual combat rather than political maneuvering, looked almost regretful as he gave the order to commence bombardment. The first stone struck Thorngate's outer walls at noon. The second phase of Kaedric's plan activated that same night when supply convoys heading toward the siege camp found themselves under attack by forces that appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. Small, coordinated raids that destroyed food shipments and killed guards before melting back into darkness. Elena's networks had begun their part of the operation. By the third day, the siege had settled into brutal routine. Catapults hammered Thorngate's walls during daylight hours, while defenders returned fire with arrows and their own artillery. Nights brought attempted assaults that Brennan's soldiers repelled with practiced efficiency. Meanwhile, reports arrived through secret channels describing increasing chaos in the Crown's supply lines. Kaedric moved through it all like a ghost, appearing on walls during attacks, meeting with officers between bombardments, maintaining the absolute authority that held Thorngate together, even as stone and hope slowly crumbled under sustained assault. On the 7th day, the southern wall developed a crack that would become a breach if the bombardment continued. On the 10th day, food rations were reduced as supplies depleted faster than anticipated. On the 14th day, Lord General Aldrich received word that 3 more supply convoys had been destroyed and reinforcements from the capital were delayed by unexplained problems with river crossings. And on the 15th day, Kedric received a message that changed everything. It came from the capital itself, smuggled through channels that should not have existed. 4 words written in handwriting Kedric recognized from historical documents in Thorngate's library. The king's own hand. We need to talk. The meeting was arranged through intermediaries operating in the gray space between armies. Neutral ground 3 miles east of both forces. An abandoned chapel that had survived centuries of weather but not enough congregation to justify maintenance. Cedric arrived with a Brennan and 4 guards, which was either bravery or stupidity, depending on perspective. King Edmund came with similar escort, which suggested he was either desperate or genuinely interested in resolution beyond simple surrender. They met inside the chapel while guards waited outside. 2 men who had never actually spoken face-to-face despite years of political maneuvering across distance. The king was younger than Cedric expected, maybe 40, with the kind of worn authority that came from inheriting power without quite enough support to wield it comfortably. His face showed intelligence and exhaustion in equal measure. Duke Ashford. The king's voice carried no hostility, just assessment. You are either the bravest man in my kingdom or the most self-destructive. Those are not mutually exclusive, your majesty. Cedric remained standing despite the king's gesture toward rough wooden benches. What did you want to discuss? Whether there is a version of this that ends without one of us destroying the other. Edmund moved to the chapel's single intact window. I did not want this siege. I wanted a peaceful resolution to legitimate concerns about your methods. You wanted me controlled. There is a difference. Perhaps. The king turned. But you must understand my position. A duke who rules through fear and ignores protocol sets a precedent I cannot allow. If you can act with impunity, every other lord will demand the same freedom. The kingdom fragments, and if you crush me for crimes I did not commit, every other lord learns that justice means whatever the crown finds convenient. Cedric moved closer. Different fragmentation, same result. The silence stretched between them, 2 men circling the same problem from opposite directions. I do not believe you killed Halbrecht, Edmund finally said. The evidence is circumstantial and the timing too convenient. But politically, I cannot ignore his death without appearing weak. Then we have a mutual problem. Cedric's voice dropped. You need to demonstrate authority without acknowledging you are punishing an innocent man. I need to survive without admitting guilt I do not carry. Quite the puzzle. Do you have a solution? Cedric pulled a folded document from inside his coat. A confession. Not to murder, but to excessive methods in territorial governance. I acknowledge that my administration has prioritized results over procedure. I agree to formal oversight from Crown representatives and regular reports on judicial decisions. He held out the paper. In exchange, the murder charges are dropped as unproven, the siege ends, and we both walk away claiming victory. Edmund took the document and read carefully. This gives me authority over your governance. It gives you the appearance of authority. Cedric's smile was cold. Whether your representatives actually change anything depends on whether they can survive in territories where weakness gets people killed. I suspect they will spend most of their time approving decisions I have already made. That is not oversight. That is reality dressed in bureaucratic language, which is all any of us ever really accomplishes. The question is whether you prefer honest effectiveness with paperwork attached, or continuing this siege while watching your supply lines collapse, and other territories begin questioning whether crown authority means anything beyond throne room walls. The king moved to the chapel's altar and set down the confession, his hand resting on parchment that represented compromise or surrender depending on interpretation. If I accept this, I look weak to the Southern Alliance. They wanted you destroyed. If you reject it, you look weak to everyone else who watches you fail to take one fortress while your kingdom develops fractures elsewhere. Edmund met Cedric's gaze directly. There is no choice here that makes you look strong, your majesty. Only choices about which weakness you can most afford to display. The calculation played across the king's face. Political consequences weighed against military realities, personal authority measured against practical limitations. Finally, Edmund spoke. I want regular reports, monthly. Any execution above common criminality requires advance notice to crown officials. And you personally attend the summer assembly to demonstrate your submission to royal authority. Done. Cedric extended his hand. Do we have an agreement? Edmund hesitated one moment longer, then took the hand. The siege ended 3 days later with formal proclamations about renewed cooperation between crown and territory. Nothing about surrender or victory, just carefully worded statements that let everyone claim they got what they wanted. Cedric stood on Thorngate's walls watching the armies break camp and begin their slow march south. Brennan stood beside him, exhausted and visibly relieved. We survived, Your Grace. We did. But Cedric's voice carried no triumph. The question is what we survived into. Below, villagers were already emerging from shelters to assess damage and begin repairs. Soldiers moved through courtyards, organizing supplies and treating wounded. The machinery of recovery had begun before the enemy was even out of sight. Marcus approached from behind, moving with the careful steps of someone whose bones had been through too much stress. "The king's message just arrived, Your Grace. The first oversight representative will arrive in 2 weeks to begin formal reporting procedures." Kedrick nodded without turning. "Make sure we prepare appropriate documentation. I want them impressed by our efficiency." "You mean you want them overwhelmed until they stop caring about actual oversight?" "I want them to understand that some territories function precisely because they do not waste time on the illusions that comfort softer men." He finally looked at Marcus. "But if they prefer to believe they are providing meaningful supervision, that is acceptable. Perception has always mattered more than reality in politics." The old steward sighed. "You won, Your Grace. Try to look less disappointed about it." Kaedric returned his gaze to the retreating armies. "Did I win, Marcus? Or did I simply discover that even successful defiance just creates new forms of the same cage?" Before Marcus could respond, a rider appeared at the gate carrying Elena's colors. The message was brief but significant. "Supply networks maintained, ready to escalate or stand down on your command." Kedrick burned the message in a torch and sent back a single word. Wait, because the siege was over, but the larger question remained unanswered. He had proven he could resist the crown's direct assault. What he had not proven was whether resistance changed anything except who held temporary power in an endless cycle of authority and rebellion. That night, alone in his study, Kaedric wrote a letter he would never send. "To whoever finds this after I am gone, I ruled through fear because I understood that law without enforcement was just poetry. I resisted false charges because I believed truth should matter even in kingdoms built on convenient lies. And I survived because I was willing to do what softer men only threatened. But survival is not victory. And I'm beginning to suspect that all I have actually accomplished is proving that monsters can be efficient administrators when given enough territory and time. Perhaps that was always the only lesson available." He burned that letter too and watched the ashes fall. Outside, Thorngate settled into an uneasy peace. The walls had held. The Duke remained. And somewhere beyond the horizon, forces were already planning the next confrontation because power never truly rested. Just paused between conflicts while everyone pretended stability meant something more permanent than the space between storms. Kaedric closed his eyes and felt the weight of every decision that had led here, and realized with absolute clarity that he had passed the point where turning back remained possible. Whatever came next would be written in consequences he could no longer control. The peace lasted exactly 43 days before Marcus tried to kill him. Not with poison or hired assassins or any method that could be traced back through intermediaries. Just a blade in the darkness of Kaedric's own study while the Duke reviewed reports from the Crown's oversight representatives. One moment, Marcus stood in the doorway holding correspondence that required signatures. The next moment, steel flashed in lamplight, and Kaedric felt cold metal slice across his ribs as instinct threw him sideways out of the chair. The blade missed his heart by 3 inches, close enough that Kaedric understood immediately this was not warning or intimidation. This was execution attempted by the one man in Thorngate he had trusted without reservation for 15 years. They hit the floor together in a tangle of furniture and desperate violence. Marcus moved with surprising strength for his age, all the careful deference stripped away to reveal something harder underneath. The kind of focused brutality that came from men who had made peace with their own deaths before attempting murder. Kedric caught the steward's wrist as the blade came down again. His wounded side screamed protest, but adrenaline turned pain into fuel. They struggled in silence, broken only by harsh breathing and the sound of boots scrabbling for purchase on stone floors. "Why?" Kaedric managed to force the word out while simultaneously trying to avoid getting his throat opened. Marcus did not answer, just kept pressing down with methodical determination, the blade point inching closer to Kaedric's exposed neck. Sweat dripped from the old man's face, and something like regret flickered in his eyes, but his hands remained steady. Kaedric shifted his weight suddenly and threw Marcus sideways into the desk. The steward's head connected with wood hard enough to stun. The blade clattered free. Kaedric kicked it away and rolled to his feet, one hand pressed against bleeding ribs, while the other found the letter opener he kept in his belt for exactly this kind of emergency. Not that he had ever imagined the emergency would look like his most loyal servant trying to put steel through his lungs. Marcus pushed himself upright with visible effort. Blood ran from a cut above his eye, but his expression held only resignation. No fear, no anger, just the exhausted acceptance of someone who had tried something difficult and failed. You were supposed to be in the tower, the old steward said quietly, reviewing the wall repairs. Not here. So this was planned. Kadrick's voice came out rougher than intended. How long, Marcus? How long have you been waiting for the right moment to betray everything we built? Since the beginning. Marcus touched the wound on his forehead and looked at his bloody fingers with distant curiosity. Since the day your father died and you inherited this cursed territory, I watched you become exactly what he was, watched you turn brutality into governance and call it strength. And I waited for the right moment to end it before you destroyed more lives than you saved. The words landed harder than the assassination attempt. Kadrick had survived attacks before, plots and schemes and ambitious nobles who thought removing one duke would advance their interests. He had crushed them all with the same cold efficiency he applied to every threat. But this was different. This was not ambition or greed or political calculation. This was judgment delivered by the one person who had witnessed every decision, every compromise, every slow transformation from young lord into northern monster. You could have left, Kadrick said. His hand remained steady on the letter opener, but something in his chest felt fundamentally broken in ways unrelated to the knife wound. You could have resigned, fled, disappeared into any territory beyond my reach. Why stay just to murder me? Because leaving would have been cowardice. Marcus straightened despite obvious pain. And whatever else I am not a coward. Someone needed to stop you, Your Grace. Someone who understood that your effectiveness does not excuse the damage you cause. That ruling through fear is still tyranny, even when it keeps roads safe and bellies fed. Kadrick laughed, the sound bitter and hollow in the destroyed study. So you appointed yourself executioner, decided that 40 years of loyal service earned you the right to judge whether I deserve to keep breathing. I earned that right by watching you destroy every relationship you ever had in service of abstract power. Marcus took a step forward despite the letter opener aimed at his chest. Your father was a monster who died alone and unmourned. You swore you would be different. Instead, you became his perfect copy, just efficient enough that people mistook your brutality for competence. The truth of it cut deeper than steel ever could. Kadrick had built everything on the foundation of being nothing, like the man who had ruled through random cruelty and personal spite. He had created systems, established protocols, made sure every punishment served purpose beyond his own satisfaction. And somehow, he had still arrived at the same destination, alone in a tower, bleeding from an assassination attempt by the only person left who gave enough of a damn to try stopping him. Who else? Kadrick asked softly. Who else was part of this? Marcus hesitated, then shook his head. Just me. I could not ask anyone else to carry this burden. You're lying. Kadrick read the micro-expressions, the slight tension around Marcus's eyes that had always signaled deception. Someone helped you. Someone confirmed my schedule. Someone made sure guards were rotated away from this corridor at exactly the right time. The old steward said nothing. Kadrick moved toward him with the letter opener still raised. His mind worked through possibilities with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through countless threats. The oversight representative had arrived last week. New faces in Thorngate, new routines, perfect cover for coordinating an assassination attempt. It was the Crown, Kadrick said. They sent someone to recruit you, probably offered immunity, possibly gold, definitely the satisfaction of removing the northern problem with plausible deniability. No, Marcus's voice carried genuine offense. I would never work with those bureaucratic fools. They understand nothing about what holds territories together. Then who? A knock on the door froze them both. Captain Brennan's voice came through the wood, concerned but controlled. Your Grace, I heard a disturbance. Do you require assistance? Kadrick looked at Marcus. The old man looked back. Between them lay 15 years of history, countless battles survived together, a loyalty that had apparently meant less than ideological disgust with the methods required to keep power. Kadrick made a decision that surprised even himself. No, Brennan, everything is fine. Just knocked over some furniture. Continue your rounds. Footsteps retreated down the corridor. Marcus stared at his master with confusion replacing resignation. You did not turn me in. Not yet. Kadrick lowered the letter opener but did not sheath it. Because whoever helped you is still out there. And I want to know who else in Thorngate has decided that loyalty means less than moral satisfaction. I told you, I acted alone. Kedrick moved faster than injury should have allowed. The letter opener came to rest against Marcus's throat, pressing hard enough to draw a thin line of blood without cutting deeply. "Do not lie to me again." The words came out in a whisper that carried more threat than any shout. "You have been managing this fortress's logistics for decades. You know exactly how many people it takes to create a window of opportunity like tonight. So either you give me names, or I start executing everyone who had access to my schedule until the list gets short enough that the guilty parties reveal themselves through elimination." You would not. Marcus tried for certainty and achieved only hope. "I am the monster you just tried to kill." "What exactly do you think I would not do?" The silence stretched between them until finally Marcus spoke, his voice breaking slightly. "Elena Thane. She approached me 3 weeks ago, said the regional networks had decided you were too dangerous to control, that your survival had created problems beyond what they anticipated." The revelation hit like physical impact. Elena, who had brought him allies during the siege, who had coordinated the supply disruptions that saved Thorngate from being starved into submission, who had positioned herself as the architect of resistance against Crown overreach. She had been planning his elimination the entire time. Kaedric lowered the letter opener and stepped back, his mind racing through implications. If Elena wanted him dead, the entire network of regional interests probably agreed. They had used him to prove that Crown authority could be resisted, and now that the lesson was demonstrated, he had become liability rather than asset. "What were her exact words?" Kaedric asked. Marcus touched his throat where blood still seeped slowly. "She said you had served your purpose, that the Northern Territories needed new leadership before your methods contaminated the broader independence movement, that I should consider whether enabling your continued rule made me complicit in future atrocities. And you agreed with her." "I had already been thinking about it for months." Marcus moved to the overturned chair and righted it with shaking hands. "Watching you navigate the siege, seeing how easily you manipulated everyone around you, understanding that you viewed people as resources rather than lives. Elena just provided the final push toward action I should have taken years ago." Kaedric pressed his hand harder against his bleeding side. The wound needed attention, but shock and adrenaline kept immediate pain at bay. His study lay in ruins around them, furniture scattered, blood on the floor, documents strewn across stone. Everything he had built, defended, nearly died protecting. And the rot had been growing inside his own household the entire time. "How many others?" he asked. "How many people in Thorngate want me dead but lack your courage to act?" Marcus met his gaze with something like pity. "All of them, Your Grace. They fear you too much to move against you, but that does not translate to loyalty. It just means they are waiting for someone else to take the risk of removing you." The assessment was delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had conducted actual research rather than making assumptions. Marcus had probably been monitoring sentiment, identifying potential allies, building a case for assassination brick by brick while continuing to perform his duties with flawless efficiency. 40 years of service had taught him exactly where the structural weaknesses existed. "I should kill you right now," Kaedric said. His voice carried no particular emotion. "You attempted regicide. The penalty is death regardless of your reasoning." "Yes." Marcus straightened despite visible exhaustion. "You should. It would be the practical choice. Eliminate the threat, make an example, reinforce your authority through violence as you always have. But you do not think I will. I think you are confronting the reality that executing me proves everything I said about you, that you value power over people, control over connection, efficiency over humanity." Marcus took a step toward the door. "So kill me, Your Grace. Demonstrate that loyalty and decades of service mean nothing measured against the crime of challenging your methods. Give everyone in Thorngate confirmation that you are exactly the monster they fear." Kaedric's hand tightened on the letter opener. Every instinct screamed elimination. Remove the threat, secure his position, send a message that betrayal carried absolute consequences. It was what his father would have done. What any practical ruler focused on survival would do. But somewhere beneath the cold calculation, a different question surfaced. If everyone he ruled wanted him dead, if his most loyal servant had concluded that assassination was the only moral response to his governance, what exactly was he holding on to besides abstract power and the satisfaction of being right about human weakness? "Get out," Kaedric finally said. "Leave Thorngate tonight. I do not care where you go, but if I see you again, instinct will override whatever hesitation is keeping you alive right now." Marcus looked genuinely surprised. You are letting me go. I am choosing to believe that 40 years of service buys one failed assassination attempt. But that account is now empty. Kedrick moved to the door and opened it. And Marcus, tell Elena that I know about her involvement. Tell her that her networks have approximately 3 days to decide whether they want to negotiate terms or discover what happens when someone with nothing left to lose stops caring about political consequences. The old steward paused in the doorway. What will you do, Your Grace? I have no idea. The admission felt like defeat and liberation simultaneously. But I am done pretending that ruling through fear creates anything except more fear. So either I find a different approach or I burn it all down trying. Marcus studied his master's face one final time, then nodded slowly and departed without another word. Kedrick closed the door and finally allowed himself to collapse against it. His side throbbed with each breath and blood loss was starting to make the room tilt in concerning ways. He needed medical attention. He needed to secure the fortress. He needed to identify everyone involved in the assassination conspiracy before they tried again with better planning. But first he needed to understand what Marcus's words had torn open inside him. All of them want you dead. 15 years of governance. 15 years of making hard decisions, enforcing brutal justice, maintaining order through methods that kept people safe, even if they hated him for it. And the result was a fortress full of subjects who feared him too much to rebel, but would celebrate his death if someone else achieved it. That was not power. That was just elaborate prison where he happened to be holding the keys. Kedrick pushed himself upright and stumbled toward his private chambers. He needed bandages, needed time to think, needed to figure out how to survive a threat that could not be solved through intimidation or calculated violence. He stripped off his blood-soaked shirt and began binding the knife wound with methodical care. The blade had cut deep but missed anything immediately fatal. Pain was significant but manageable. He had survived worse during the siege. But those had been external threats. Enemy soldiers trying to breach walls. This was internal rot, the kind that could not be defended against because it existed in the space between orders given and loyalty assumed. A knock interrupted his dark thoughts. "Who is it?" Kedrick called out, reaching for the letter opener again. "Brennan, Your Grace. I know you said everything was fine, but your study looks like a battlefield, and there are blood trails leading to your chambers." Kedrick considered lying, then realized the time for maintaining appearances had passed somewhere between the assassination attempt and letting Marcus escape with his life. "Come in." The captain entered and froze when he saw Kedrick's bandaged side and the fresh blood still seeping through linen. Holy hell! Who did this? Someone who thought killing me would improve the Northern Territories. Kedrick secured the last bandage with hands that had started shaking slightly from shock. They were probably correct, but their timing was inconvenient. Marcus. Brennan's assessment came instantly. The guard rotation was changed last minute. I thought it was just administrative adjustment, but it created a perfect window for— He is gone, Kedrick interrupted. I let him go. The captain stared. Your Grace. He attempted regicide. I am aware I was there. Kedrick pulled on a clean shirt, each movement sending sharp protests from his ribs. But executing him accomplishes nothing except confirming everything he believes about my governance. And I am beginning to suspect he was not entirely wrong. Brennan moved closer, his soldier's instinct recognizing that this conversation was happening in territory far outside normal commander-subordinate relationships. What are you saying, Your Grace? Kedrick walked to the window overlooking Thorngate's courtyards. Below, night watch soldiers moved through their routines. Servants finished evening duties. The fortress continued functioning with mechanical precision, every person playing their assigned role in the machinery of governance he had spent years perfecting. And somewhere in that organized efficiency, they were all hoping someone would put a blade through his heart. I am saying that I have spent 15 years ruling this territory through fear and calling it strength. Kedrick's reflection in the glass looked older than his actual years. I convinced myself that effectiveness justified methods, that keeping people safe mattered more than whether they loved or hated me. And I created a fortress where everyone is terrified of their own duke. That is the nature of power, Your Grace. Perhaps. But power that exists only through terror is not actually power at all. It is just violence taking a temporary break between expressions. Kedrick turned to face Brennan. Tell me honestly, if someone killed me tomorrow, would you mourn or would you be relieved? The captain's hesitation was answer enough. Both, Brennan finally said. You're the most effective ruler the Northern Territories have seen in generations. Roads are safe, crime is minimal. People eat regularly and sleep without fear of bandits. But they also sleep without trust in their own lord. So yes, if you died, I would mourn the loss of competent governance while simultaneously wondering if maybe someone gentler might accomplish the same results. At least you are honest. Kedrick returned to the bandages and began rewrapping the section that had already soaked through. I need you to do something that will sound insane. The captain straightened. Your Grace, send word to Elena Thane. Tell her I want a meeting. Neutral territory, minimal guards, full disclosure of her network's involvement in tonight's assassination attempt. And tell her that if she refuses, I will spend however many days I have left systematically destroying every regional interest she has spent years building. You are going to negotiate with people who just tried to kill you. I am going to find out if there is any version of the Northern Territories that does not require me to be the monster Marcus described. Kedrick finished the bandages. And if there is not, then at least I will have confirmed that the only options available are tyranny or chaos. Either way, I am done pretending that maintaining power through fear creates anything worth preserving. Brennan absorbed this in silence, then nodded once. I will send the message. But Your Grace, if this is a trap, then you will inherit a fortress and a warning about what happens when rulers confuse control with leadership. Kedrick moved toward the door. Now get that message sent. We have 3 days before Elena's networks decide whether I am worth the effort of a second assassination attempt. The captain departed to execute his orders. Kedrick stood alone in chambers that suddenly felt less like private sanctuary and more like the cell of someone who had mistaken imprisonment for safety. 15 years of careful governance, of brutal efficiency, of doing whatever was necessary to maintain order. And the result was a territory full of people who would rather risk his wrath than continue living under his protection. That was not legacy. That was just evidence that competence without humanity created nothing except well-organized resentment. He returned to his study despite Brennan's suggestion to rest. The room still showed signs of the struggle. Furniture displaced, blood on stone, the physical evidence of how close he had come to dying by the hand of someone he trusted. Kedrick righted his desk and began composing a letter to Elena with hands that refused to stay entirely steady. Not from fear, from something deeper. The recognition that everything he thought he understood about power and governance had been revealed as elaborate self-deception. Fear kept people obedient. It did not make them loyal. Strength maintained order. It did not create connection. And efficiency was meaningless if the only thing being efficiently maintained was a system where everyone involved wished for its architect's death. The letter took 3 attempts before the words came out right. I know you sent Marcus to kill me. I know your networks decided I was more liability than asset. You were probably right on both counts. But before you try again, I want one conversation. Just you and me. No guards, no hidden blades, no political theater. Because I need to understand if what I built here is worth saving, or if the only mercy available is burning it down before it consumes anyone else. He sealed it and sent it with a rider before doubt could change his mind. Then Kedrick returned to his chambers and allowed himself to feel the full weight of what Marcus's betrayal had revealed. Not just that assassination attempts happened, that was expected, but that the person closest to him, who had witnessed every decision and knew every motivation, had concluded that murder was the only moral response. If the man who understood him best in the world believed he deserved execution, what did that say about everything else he had convinced himself was necessary? Sleep came eventually, but brought no rest. Just dreams of his father's face laughing from the shadows while blood pooled on stone floors that never quite came clean no matter how much scrubbing occurred in waking hours. Kedrick woke before dawn with his side screaming and his mind racing through scenarios that all ended in variations of destruction. 2 days until Elena responded. 2 days to decide if he wanted to survive whatever was coming, or if Marcus had been right that the Northern Territories would be better served by his absence. And underneath everything else, one terrible question that refused to stay buried. If ruling required becoming a monster, and monsters inevitably died alone and unmourned, what was the actual point of holding power in the first place? Elena's reply arrived on schedule, carried by the same messenger who had delivered Kedrick's letter. The response was shorter than expected. Just coordinates and a time. 24 hours from now. The ruins at Blackwater Ridge, equidistant from both their territories. Brennan tried one more time to talk him out of it. "This is suicide, Your Grace. She tried to have you killed once already." Meeting alone gives her a perfect opportunity to finish the job. Kedrick checked his weapons with methodical care. If she wanted me dead at Blackwater Ridge, she could have hired assassins for that. The fact that she agreed to meet suggests she wants something that requires me alive, at least temporarily. And what do you want from this meeting? The truth. About what I have become and whether it can be fixed. Kedrick strapped a blade to his forearm and another to his boot, or confirmation that the only thing I am actually good at is being the kind of ruler people celebrate removing. The ride to Blackwater Ridge took 6 hours through terrain that grew progressively more isolated. Kedrick went alone despite Brennan's protests, leaving Thorngate in the captain's command with instructions to execute contingency plans if he failed to return within 48 hours. The ruins themselves were remnants of a fortress that predated the current kingdom, stone walls weathered by centuries into abstract sculptures of what power looked like. After time eroded everything except foundations. An appropriate setting for a conversation about the impermanence of authority built on fear. Elena arrived from the opposite direction exactly on time. She came alone as promised, riding a dark horse that moved with the confidence of an animal trained for combat. Up close, she looked harder than during their previous meetings, as if recent events had stripped away whatever diplomatic polish she usually maintained. They dismounted simultaneously and met in the center of the ruins with hands visible and weapons holstered. "You look like hell, Duke Ashford." Assassination attempts have that effect. Kedrick studied her face for signs of deception or planned violence. "Why did you do it, Elena?" "We had an alliance. I held Thorngate exactly as you asked. Your networks got their demonstration that Crown authority could be resisted, and you became more dangerous than the Crown in the process." Elena moved to a section of collapsed wall and sat with the weariness of someone who had spent days dealing with political fallout. "Do you have any idea what you actually demonstrated, Duke Ashford? Not that regional autonomy was possible. That one sufficiently ruthless lord could hold territory through pure intimidation, while everyone around him lived in constant fear of making mistakes. That was always the reality. I just stopped pretending otherwise." "Exactly. And that honesty made you a symbol we could no longer afford." Elena pulled a flask from her coat and took a drink before offering it to Kedrick. "The coastal provinces want independence from incompetent central authority. They do not want to replace that authority with local tyrants who rule through threat of execution. You proved the concept could work, but you also proved it only worked if someone was willing to be the monster. And that created problems for everyone trying to build something sustainable. So you decided to remove the problem." Kedrick accepted the flask and drank. The whiskey burned down his injured side. "Convenient that removing me also eliminated the person most likely to see through your network's eventual power grab. There is that too." Elena's smile held no apology. "But mostly it was recognition that what you built in Thorngate was not replicable without creating dozens of other ruthless lords, and that outcome serves no one except people who enjoy brutality for its own sake. I never enjoyed it." "No, you just accepted it as necessary. Which is arguably worse because it means you weaponized morality against itself. You made cruelty efficient and called it governance." Elena stood and moved closer, and the terrifying thing is that it worked. Roads stayed safe, people ate regularly, crime disappeared. All the practical measures of successful leadership got achieved through methods that destroyed any possibility of actual community. What would you have done differently? Kedrick's voice rose slightly. How would you have maintained order in territories where bandits outnumbered soldiers and corruption had become institutional tradition? Please, enlighten me about the gentle approach that somehow escaped my consideration. I do not know. Elena met his anger with unexpected calm. Maybe there is no gentle approach. Maybe you were right that some territories can only be governed through fear until stability creates space for softer methods. But that does not change the fact that you became too comfortable with brutality. That you stopped looking for alternatives because intimidation was efficient. Because alternatives get people killed while you debate the ethics of response. Sometimes, yes. Elena moved to stand directly in front of him. And sometimes the refusal to explore alternatives is just cowardice disguised as pragmatism. You convinced yourself that any method less brutal than yours would fail. And you never tested that assumption because failure would have meant admitting you had other choices all along. The accusation landed precisely where defenses were thinnest. Kedrick had spent 15 years certain that his methods were necessary, that softness would be exploited, that mercy would be seen as weakness, that the only language power understood was force applied without hesitation. And maybe that had been true initially when he inherited territories on the edge of chaos. But somewhere along the way, necessary had become komoshichi, had become comfortable. Brutality had become default rather than last resort. And he had stopped asking whether each act of violence was actually required or just easier than alternatives that demanded more creativity and patience. Why are we having this conversation instead of you trying to finish what Marcus started? Kedrick asked quietly. Because I think you already know everything I am saying. Elena's voice softened slightly. Marcus said you let him go, that you could have executed him immediately and chose not to. That does not sound like the Duke Ashford your reputation describes. Maybe I was just too tired to care about eliminating one more threat. Or maybe you realized that continuing down the same path leads nowhere except more isolation and eventual assassination by the next person who decides they have moral obligation to stop you. Elena sat down again on the ruined wall. So I am offering a different option. I am listening. Leave Thorngate. Voluntarily. Publicly. Announce that you are transferring authority to a council and stepping away from active governance. Elena pulled a document from inside her coat. My networks will ensure the transition happens smoothly. The Crown will be informed that regional interests have resolved the northern problem internally. And you get to walk away instead of dying in your own fortress by the hand of someone who used to serve you. Kedrick read the document in silence. It was thorough, professionally drafted, clearly the product of lawyers who had spent significant time planning how to remove him with minimal chaos. His name appeared throughout as willing participant rather than defeated ruler. The language suggested retirement rather than forced abdication. It was mercy dressed in bureaucratic efficiency. And you think I will just walk away from everything I built? I think you do not actually want what you built. Elena stood and retrieved the document. I think you wanted to be different from your father and somehow ended up exactly the same. And I think you are tired enough of being the monster that letting go might feel like relief rather than defeat. Kedrick stared at the ruins surrounding them. Stone walls that had witnessed the rise and fall of powers greater than anything he would ever command. His own fortress would probably still be standing centuries from now, regardless of who held authority within its walls. The question was whether his presence inside those walls created anything worth preserving, or just maintained elaborate machinery designed to prove that fear worked as governance tool. What happens to Thorngate if I agree? He asked. The council manages daily administration with oversight from regional networks and crown representatives. It will not be as efficient as your rule. There will be mistakes and corruption and all the usual problems that come from shared authority. But people will sleep without fearing their own lord. And maybe that trade-off is worth the decreased efficiency. And what happens to me? You disappear. Change your name if you want. Settle somewhere no one knows your face. Live whatever life you wish as long as it does not involve governing territories through intimidation. Elena held out the document. Or you refuse, return to Thorngate, and wait for the next assassination attempt, which will come. Because I am not the only person who decided you were too dangerous to control. Kedrick took the paper and read it again more carefully. Everything about it suggested preparation, contingency planning, networks coordinating to remove him with minimal disruption to broader independence movements. They had been planning this long before Marcus's failed attempt, probably since the moment the siege ended and they realized the monster they had helped survive was not interested in being anyone's controlled asset. How long? He asked. How long before you decided I was expendable? About 10 minutes after you refused to commit to coordinated action with other territories. Elena's smile was sad. You made it very clear that you would work with us only as long as it served your purposes. That kind of unpredictable power is useful during crisis, but becomes liability during reconstruction. We needed proof that resistance was possible. You provided that. Now we need something sustainable, and you are not that person. Because I rule through fear. Because you are comfortable ruling through fear. There is a difference. Elena moved toward her horse. Take the night to think about it, Duke Ashford. Read the document. Consider whether dying for abstract power is actually worth the effort, and meet me back here tomorrow with your decision. She mounted and rode off without waiting for response, leaving Kedrick alone in ruins that suddenly felt like preview of his own eventual fate. He read the document 3 more times as afternoon light faded into evening. Every clause was carefully crafted to give him honorable exit while ensuring he could never return to power. It was not unconditional mercy, just pragmatic elimination of a problem through means less violent than assassination. The smart choice was obvious. Sign the document, walk away. Let someone else struggle with the impossible task of governing territories that demanded brutality, while condemning those brutal enough to provide it. But walking away meant admitting that everything he had built was worthless. That 15 years of hard decisions and ruthless efficiency had created nothing except well-organized fear waiting for his absence to transform into chaos or celebration, depending on which subjects you asked. And Kaedric was not sure which possibility hurt more. He camped in the ruins that night, building a small fire against the cold and watching stars appear overhead in patterns his father had taught him to read during rare moments when the old bastard had been sober enough to pretend at parenthood. "What would you do?" Kaedric asked the darkness. "Give up or force them to kill you for the principle of not surrendering?" The darkness, predictably, offered no response. By morning, Kaedric had made his decision, not because it was smart or right or would lead to any outcome he wanted, but because continuing to be the Duke of Thorngate required believing that fear-based governance was worth defending, and somewhere between Marcus's assassination attempt and Elena's clinical offer of exile, that belief had cracked beyond repair. He met Elena at the ruins exactly as arranged, and when she saw his face, she understood the answer before he spoke. "I will sign," Kaedric said. His voice carried no emotion. "But I want 3 conditions." Elena waited. First, Marcus gets full pardon for his attempted assassination. Whatever settlement you negotiate includes protecting him from any retaliation or investigation. Agreed. Second, Captain Brennan and his officers retain their positions under the new council. They are good soldiers who followed bad orders. They should not suffer for my methods. Also agreed. Third. Kaedric pulled out his own document, something he had written during the long night while contemplating futures he would never see. "I want formal acknowledgement that the Northern Territories thrived under my rule by every practical measure except the one that actually matters. I want it recorded that I kept people safe and fed and protected while simultaneously making them wish for my death. Because that contradiction needs to be preserved as warning about what happens when efficiency becomes divorced from humanity." Elena read his addition carefully. "This is essentially confession that your governance was fundamentally flawed." "Yes. And it needs to be because otherwise someone else will try the same approach and convince themselves that being slightly less brutal will somehow achieve different results." Kaedric's hand remained steady as he signed Elena's document and attached his own addendum. "Let the historical record show that ruling through fear works until it destroys the person doing the ruling. Maybe that stops the next monster from thinking they can be different." They finalized the agreement in the ruins where previous powers had also discovered that authority was temporary and legacy was just another word for the stories people told after you stopped mattering. Kaedric rode back to Thorngate one final time to oversee the transition personally, and somewhere between the ruins and his fortress, something fundamental shifted inside him. Not redemption exactly, just recognition that the man he had become was no longer sustainable, and the only choice left was transformation or dissolution. Either he changed who he was at the most foundational level, or he stopped being anyone at all. The question was whether transformation remained possible for someone who had spent 15 years proving that brutality worked better than alternatives he had never seriously explored. He had 3 days to find out before Elena's networks implemented the transition, and Duke Kaedric Ashford disappeared into whatever came after monsters voluntarily relinquished their power. The transition lasted exactly 18 hours before everything collapsed into violence. Kaedric had returned to Thorngate with Elena's signed agreement and his own resignation already drafted. He gathered his officers in the Great Hall at dawn, the same room where he had faced down 27 lords and survived Marcus's assassination attempt. The same stone walls that had witnessed 15 years of brutal governance now watched him prepare to dismantle everything he had built. Captain Brennan stood at attention with the fortress command assembled behind him. Their faces showed confusion more than understanding. Orders had been vague, just instructions to gather for an announcement of critical importance. Kaedric did not waste time on ceremony. Effective immediately, I am transferring authority over the Northern Territories to a governing council. My command ends today. Captain Brennan will maintain military operations during the transition period. All existing protocols remain in effect until the council establishes new procedures. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Brennan spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "Your Grace, I do not understand. We survived the siege. The crown accepted your terms. What has changed? Everything. Nothing. Kadric looked at each officer in turn. I have spent 15 years ruling through fear and calling it strength. That approach maintained order, but it also created a fortress where everyone wishes for my absence. So I am providing what they want before the next assassination attempt succeeds. There was no assassination attempt, one of the younger officers said. You are the strongest ruler the North has ever— Marcus tried to kill me 3 nights ago. Kadric's voice cut through the denial like steel through fabric. Right here in this fortress. With a blade meant for my heart. And he did it because he spent 40 years watching me become the monster my father was. He failed only because my schedule changed, not because loyalty prevented the attempt. The revelation hit them like physical impact. Marcus, who everyone knew as Kadric's most trusted advisor, had committed treason violent enough to shatter any illusion about how the Duke was actually perceived by those closest to him. So you are surrendering, another officer said, letting them win. I am choosing to stop being the problem. There is a difference. Kadric moved toward the window overlooking courtyards that would soon belong to someone else. The Northern Territories will survive my departure. They survived before me. They will find new leadership and probably govern more gently if less efficiently. And I will discover whether anything exists for me beyond being the man people fear. Where will you go? Brennan asked quietly. Somewhere far enough that no one remembers my face or knows what I did to keep these territories functioning. Kadric turned from the window. You have your orders, Captain. Execute the transition. Protect the fortress during the changeover. And try not to let whoever replaces me undo everything that actually worked, just because the methods made them uncomfortable. He left the hall before questions could become arguments. There was nothing left to debate. The decision was made, the document signed, the machinery of abdication already in motion. Elena's networks would arrive by evening to begin implementing the council structure. By tomorrow, Duke Kadric Ashford would be a historical problem rather than a present threat. The plan was clean, efficient, designed to minimize disruption. It lasted until noon, when riders appeared on the southern road carrying banners that had not been seen in the north for 3 generations. House Ravencourt, the family Kaedric's father had destroyed so thoroughly that their name had become cautionary tale about what happened when lesser nobility challenged Ashford authority. Brennan found Kaedric in his study packing documents that needed to be destroyed, rather than left for whatever council eventually took control. Your Grace, we have a situation. The captain's voice carried tension that immediately shifted Kadric's attention from papers to threat assessment. Ravencourt forces are approaching from the south, approximately 300 soldiers. They are not slowing. Kadric moved to the tower windows and pulled out his spyglass. The riders were indeed carrying Ravencourt colors, black and crimson standards that should not exist because that house had been stripped of lands, titles, and military authority 15 years ago during his father's final purge of rival families. Someone had been rebuilding in secret, gathering forces, waiting for exactly this moment when Thorngate's authority was in transition and its duke was preparing to abdicate. How did they know? Brennan asked. The transition was supposed to be confidential until— Elena. Kadric lowered the spyglass, his mind already calculating implications. She said my networks needed to know. Probably notified everyone with regional interest that Thorngate was changing hands. And someone saw an opportunity. What are your orders? Kadric looked at the approaching army, then at the half-packed documents on his desk. Everything in him screamed to grab weapons and armor, to mount the walls and defend what was his through the same brutal efficiency that had maintained control for 15 years. But that person was supposed to be dead. That version of Duke Ashford had signed papers agreeing to walk away from power. The question was whether abdication meant anything when forces were literally at the gates demanding blood payment for historical grievances. Get the fortress to defensive positions, Kadric finally said. His voice carried the cold calculation that had never really disappeared despite 3 days of philosophical crisis. Full lockdown, civilians to interior chambers, artillery crews to the walls, and send riders to Elena's last known position. Tell her that her careful transition plan just got complicated by people who apparently think a change in leadership means weakness to exploit. You are not leaving, not until I understand what Ravencourt actually wants. Kadric began pulling on the armor he had hoped never to wear again. Maybe they just want to reclaim lands my father took from them. Maybe this ends with a negotiation. Brennan's expression suggested he believed negotiation was unlikely. And if they want blood payment for what your father did to their house, then they are going to discover that sins of the father transfer to the son, whether he wants them or not. Kaedric strapped on his sword with movements that had become automatic through years of defending territory against people who thought vulnerability meant opportunity. Get everyone armed, Captain, and make sure they understand that this is not a siege we can wait out. Ravencourt came here for specific purpose, and they will not leave until they achieve it or die trying. The captain departed at a run. Kedrick finished arming himself in silence, each weapon a familiar weight that represented choices he thought he had moved beyond. The sword his father had given him before dying in this same fortress. The knife Marcus had taught him to throw before attempting assassination with a different blade. The armor that bore scratches from the crown's siege just weeks ago. Everything he had tried to leave behind was wrapping around him again, like second skin that refused to shed. By the time he reached the walls, Ravencourt forces had stopped just outside arrow range. A single rider separated from their formation and approached under parley flag. Young woman, maybe 25, sitting her horse with the rigid control of someone managing fury through sheer force of will. Kedrick met her at the gate with Brennan and 6 guards. Close enough for conversation, far enough that treachery would require exceptional archery skills. The woman removed her helmet. Her face was striking in the way sharp blades were striking, all angles and intensity, dark hair pulled back severely, eyes that held the specific hatred that came from personal loss rather than abstract grudge. Duke Ashford. Her voice carried across the space between armies. I am Seraphina Ravencourt, daughter of the house your father annihilated, sister to the brothers he murdered, inheritor of lands he stole, and a name he tried to erase from history. Kaedric felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear exactly. Recognition that some debts could not be negotiated away regardless of current circumstances. My father committed many crimes, he said carefully. If you have come for restitution, I have come for justice. Seraphina's horse shifted beneath her, but she controlled it with unconscious skill. Your father killed my family during a feast we hosted in good faith. He claimed they were plotting rebellion. The truth was, he wanted our territories and used accusations of treason as excuse for slaughter. That sounds like him. Kaedric's acknowledgement seemed to surprise her. I am not my father, Lady Ravencourt. I do not govern through random cruelty or invented charges. If you have legitimate claim to seized properties, I have claim to your life. Her words were flat, factual. Blood debt for blood spilled. Your father is dead, but his son remains. And by the laws your own family enforced for generations, inherited title means inherited obligation, including debts paid in survival. So you came here to kill me. Kaedric glanced at the 300 soldiers waiting behind her. That seems like excessive force for one execution. I came here to ensure you cannot escape. Seraphina gestured toward her army. And to make certain that whatever council tries to replace you understands that Ravencourt reclaims what was stolen, starting with northern territories that once belonged to my house. Those territories were lawfully transferred through force and murder disguised as legal process. Her voice rose slightly. My family died so yours could expand power. And now I am here to demonstrate that historical crimes do not disappear just because the criminal died, and his successor seems slightly less sadistic. Kedrick studied her face, seeing past the hatred to something more complex underneath. This was not random revenge. This was calculated reclamation, timed precisely for the moment when Thorngate was most vulnerable. Someone had been feeding her information about the transition, about his planned abdication, about exactly when to strike for maximum impact. Who told you I was leaving? He asked. Does it matter? Seraphina's smile held no warmth. You signed papers surrendering your authority. Your own people want you gone. The Crown considers you a problem barely contained. And now Ravencourt has arrived to collect debts your father never paid. This is not negotiation, Duke Ashford. This is inevitability. Then you have miscalculated. Kaedric's voice dropped to the dangerous quiet that preceded violence. Because the man who is leaving might have negotiated. The man who signed abdication papers might have found peaceful resolution. But the man you forced back into this armor by threatening his fortress understands only one response to armies at the gates. You cannot win this fight. 300 trained soldiers against your depleted garrison? Winning is not the question. Kadric turned and began walking back toward Thorngate's gates. The question is how much blood you are willing to pay for revenge against a dead man's son. Because I promise you, Lady Ravencourt, before you reach the fortress interior, you will understand exactly why the Northern Territories fear the Ashford name, regardless of which generation holds it. Wait. Her voice stopped him. You would fight rather than surrender. You would kill my soldiers for crimes you admit your father committed. I would defend what is mine from people who mistake transition for weakness. Kedrick looked back at her. Your father was murdered. That was wrong. But coming here with an army demanding blood payment 15 years later while I am literally trying to walk away from power, that is not justice. That is opportunism dressed in historical grievance. Then give me what I came for. Seraphina dismounted and approached on foot, hands visible and weapon sheathed. Trial by combat, you and me. Winner takes Thorngate and determines how Ravencourt claims are resolved. Your soldiers stand down. My army withdraws if I fall. One fight settles everything. The proposal hung in the air between them. Brennan immediately stepped forward. Your Grace, this is insanity. She is trying to— I know what she is trying to do. Kadric cut him off. She is trying to get revenge while avoiding a siege that will cost hundreds of lives on both sides. And she is offering me exactly what I was planning to do anyway. Walk away from Thorngate. The only difference is whether I do it voluntarily or after losing single combat. If you lose, we lose everything. The captain's voice carried desperation now. The fortress, the territories, any hope of orderly transition. If I refuse, we get a siege that destroys half the countryside. While Elena's networks and the crown watch me defend power, I already agreed to surrender. Kadric looked at Seraphina standing in the space between armies. At least trial by combat has the benefit of resolving multiple problems simultaneously. He turned to Brennan. If I fall, you surrender Thorngate to Ravencourt forces under terms of honorable defeat. Cooperate with their governance and protect the civilians during transition. Understood. Your Grace. That is an order, Captain. Brennan saluted with visible reluctance. Understood, Your Grace. Kadric faced Seraphina again. Trial by combat. First blood or death? Death. Her response came without hesitation. Too many debts for anything less. Then we understand each other. Kedric began removing unnecessary armor, keeping only the essentials that would allow mobility. 1 hour to prepare. The courtyard inside Thorngate's gates. Your second can observe from the walls to ensure fairness. Seraphina nodded and returned to her army to make preparations. Kedric walked back into Thorngate with Brennan following in shocked silence. The fortress was already organized for defense, soldiers at positions, artillery loaded, everything ready for siege that would now be decided by single combat between two people carrying inherited hatred. In his chambers, Kedric continued removing armor until only light leather protection remained. The wound Marcus had given him 3 days ago throbbed with each movement, barely healed and certainly not ready for combat stress. But pain was just information. Weakness was just another variable to account for. Brennan watched from the doorway. You do not have to do this, Your Grace. We can fight. We have held against worse odds. And win what exactly? Kedric checked his blade's edge, finding it acceptable but not perfect. Even if we survive a siege, I am still leaving. The transition still happens. The only difference is how many people die first and whether I walk away or get carried out. This is not about logic. The captain moved closer. This is about you finding a way to die that feels meaningful after 3 days of realizing you do not know how to live outside the role you built. Maybe? Kedric set down his sword and met Brennan's eyes directly. Or maybe this is about accepting that some debts actually do transfer across generations. My father murdered her family during a feast. That is not contested history. It is documented fact. And I have spent 15 years benefiting from territories he seized through that slaughter. So perhaps losing one fight is appropriate payment. You are not your father. No. But I am his heir. An inheritance means more than just titles and land. It means carrying forward the consequences of previous choices whether you made them or not. Kedric picked up his sword again. She wants justice. I am giving her the opportunity to take it from the person who actually benefited from historical crimes. And if you win, then I prove I deserve to survive my father's legacy. And she proves her family was not strong enough to reclaim what was taken. Either way, one of us walks away, and the other becomes footnote in someone else's story about how blood debts eventually get paid. The hour passed too quickly. Kedrick descended to the courtyard where trial by combat had been arranged. Simple space, hard-packed earth, walls close enough that neither fighter could retreat to safe distance. Serafina was already there, armored similarly light, holding a blade that looked like family heirloom rather than military issue. Both armies watched from positions that ensured visibility, but prevented interference. Brennan stood on the walls with Ravencourt second, both men looking like they wished they could stop this, but understanding that some moments existed outside authority's reach. Kedrick and Serafina faced each other across the courtyard. No formal speeches, no ceremony beyond the gesture that marked combat beginning. Just two people carrying inherited hatred and personal loss into a space where only one would walk away. Serafina moved first. She came in fast, blade work efficient and trained, each strike designed to test defense and identify weaknesses. Kedrick deflected and countered, his own style more brutal and direct, shaped by years of actual combat rather than formal training. Steel met steel in patterns that would have been beautiful if they were not trying to kill each other. The wound in Kedrick's side protested each twist and lunge, sending sharp reminders that he was fighting injured against an opponent who had come here prepared and rested. Blood began seeping through his shirt where stitches pulled apart under stress. Serafina saw it and pressed the advantage. Her attacks focused on his right side, forcing movements that aggravated the injury until pain became constant background noise. But pain was familiar. Pain was something Kedrick had learned to weaponize during the siege, during Marcus's attack, during 15 years of surviving threats that should have killed him. He let her drive him backward toward the courtyard wall, let her think injury had created opening, then pivoted suddenly, using the wall for leverage and bringing his blade around an arc that forced her to choose between retreat and getting her shoulder opened. She retreated. Barely. And in that moment of defensive reaction, Kedrick saw exactly what she was beneath the hatred and the inherited vendetta. Someone who had spent years preparing for this moment, training for it, dreaming about it, and now facing the reality that revenge was harder than fantasy when the target fought back. They circled each other, both breathing hard, both bleeding from minor cuts that had accumulated during exchanges too fast for conscious tracking. "Your father killed mine during a feast," Serafina said between breaths. "Did yours ever tell you why?" Kedrick deflected a sudden thrust. "Because he wanted the land and your father refused to sell. Because my father discovered your father was running slave operations through the northern mines." She attacked again, forcing him to give ground. Human trafficking disguised as criminal labor. "And when my father threatened to bring evidence to the crown, yours invited us to dinner and killed everyone who knew." The revelation landed harder than her blade ever could. Kedrick had spent 15 years believing his father was just brutal ruler who governed through fear. The possibility that beneath that brutality lay actual criminality of the sort that justified elimination changed calculations he had spent his entire adult life making. "If that is true," he said, parrying a strike that nearly got through his defense, "then your father was murdered for trying to do the right thing, and mine deserved execution." Yes. Serafina's next attack came with everything she had, fury and grief, and 15 years of waiting finally channeled into single purpose. "Which is why you inherited his debt. Why this fight matters. Why I will not stop until one of us is dead." Their blades locked, faces inches apart, both of them straining against each other while trying not to collapse from exhaustion and accumulated damage. "I am sorry," Kedrick said quietly, "for what he did, for what I benefited from. For every year you spent planning revenge while I ruled territories bought with your family's blood. Sorry does not bring them back." "No." Kedrick shoved hard, breaking the lock and creating space. "But maybe it explains why I'm not trying as hard to win as I should be." The admission hung between them. Serafina attacked again, but there was something different in her strikes now. Confusion, mixing with fury. Calculation interrupted by the reality that her opponent was fighting to survive, but not fighting to destroy. Kedrick deflected, countered, moved through combat patterns that had been automatic for so long they required no conscious thought. But he was not creating openings that would end this quickly. Was not using the techniques Brennan had taught him for killing opponents efficiently. He was fighting to a different purpose. Something that looked like survival, but felt more like penance. They had been fighting for 20 minutes when Kedrick's wounded side finally gave out completely. A particularly violent twist sent Payne sharp enough that his defense dropped for half a second. Serafina's blade got it through and opened a line across his chest that was not immediately fatal but would become so if left untreated. Kedrick stumbled backward. His vision grayed at the edges from blood loss and exhaustion. The sword felt impossibly heavy in hands that had killed dozens of men but could barely hold steel steady now. Serafina advanced for the killing strike, then stopped, because Kedrick had lowered his blade entirely. Was standing in the middle of the courtyard with his weapon pointed at the ground and blood soaking through his shirt. No defense. No attempt to dodge or deflect. Just a man who had decided that some debts required payment in full. "Do it," he said. His voice carried clearly despite the weakness spreading through his limbs. "Your family deserves justice. This is as close as you will get." Serafina held her blade steady, point aimed at his heart. Her face showed confusion warring with satisfaction, warring with something else that looked almost like disappointment. "Why?" The question came out harsh. "Why are you not fighting?" "Because you were right." Kedrick's laugh came out as cough that brought blood to his lips. "I inherited my father's debt. I benefited from his crimes. And I have spent 3 days learning that everything I built was just prettier version of his brutality. So if killing me resolves something, then at least my death has more meaning than my governance. That is not justice." Serafina's blade wavered slightly. "That is suicide. Maybe." Kedrick's vision was definitely fading now. "Or maybe it is just the first honest decision I have made in 15 years. You wanted blood payment, take it, and try to govern these territories better than my father or I ever did." The blade remained pointed at his heart but did not strike. Around them, both armies watched in complete silence, waiting for the killing blow that would resolve everything. The death that would finally balance accounts opened 15 years ago with murder during a feast. Serafina's hand shook slightly. Then she lowered her blade. "I cannot kill a man who will not defend himself," she said quietly. "That is not justice. That is just murder. And I am not my father any more than you are yours." She stepped back, blood-stained sword hanging loose at her side. Kedrick sank to his knees as adrenaline finally abandoned him entirely. Around him, the courtyard spun in lazy circles that suggested blood loss had progressed beyond safe levels. Voices were shouting, but they came from very far away. Hands were lifting him, but he could not tell whose or why. The last thing he saw before consciousness slipped away was Serafina's face above him, her expression showing the same exhausted recognition he felt. That revenge was not actually satisfying when delivered to someone who agreed they deserved it. That justice looked different when you stood face to face with inherited hatred and realized both of you were just people trying to survive legacies neither of you chose. That some fights ended without winners because the victory conditions were impossible from the start. Then darkness took him completely, and the question of what came next belonged to whoever was still standing when he woke up. If he woke up. Kedrick woke to the sound of rain against stone and the realization that consciousness meant he had somehow survived bleeding out in a courtyard while 2 armies watched. The first sensation was pain, deep and comprehensive, radiating from his side and chest in waves that suggested significant damage barely held together by whatever medical intervention had occurred while he was unconscious. The second sensation was confusion about why he was waking up in what appeared to be his own chambers rather than a grave or a Ravencourt prison cell. He tried to sit up. His body vetoed the decision immediately with pain sharp enough to gray his vision at the edges. A voice spoke from somewhere near the window. "I would not recommend movement for at least another day. You lost enough blood that the physicians were not certain you would survive the night." Kedrick turned his head carefully. Serafina Ravencourt sat in the chair Marcus used to occupy during their evening strategy sessions, her posture suggesting she had been there for hours. She wore simple traveling clothes rather than armor, and her face showed exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. "How long?" Kedrick managed to ask. His throat felt like gravel. 3 days. She poured water from a pitcher beside the bed and brought it to him without hesitation. "You needed surgery to repair the damage. Infection set in on the 2nd day. We were not certain the fever would break. Kedrick drank slowly, each swallow burning. "You stayed. Where else would I go?" Serafina returned to her chair. "I am the one who opened your chest. Walking away while you died from my blade seemed like cowardice. You could have finished what you started in the courtyard. I thought about it." Her smile was bitter. "Would have been easy. 1 thrust while you were unconscious and blood debt paid in full. But that felt wrong somehow. Killing a man in combat is justice. Murdering him in a sickbed is just murder regardless of historical grievances. Kaedric absorbed this information slowly, his mind working through implications despite the fog of pain and medication. Serafina had spent 3 days keeping him alive after nearly killing him in trial by combat. That suggested either exceptionally complicated revenge or something else entirely. "Why am I not in a Ravencourt prison cell?" he asked. "Because we are not at war." She stood and moved to the window, looking out at rain-soaked courtyards. "After you collapsed, your Captain Brennan demanded to know my intentions. I told him the trial by combat ended without clear victor, that neither of us could continue fighting, that historical debts remained unresolved and required different approach than single combat. And he accepted that. He accepted that 300 of my soldiers were still outside his gates, and that starting a siege over your unconscious body served no one's interests." Serafina turned from the window. "We negotiated temporary truce. My people remain camped outside Thorngate. Your people maintain the fortress, and both of us wait to see if you survive before deciding what happens next. So my death still resolves everything. Your death creates a vacuum that we would then fight over. Not quite the same thing." She returned to the chair. "Turns out that inherited hatred is simpler when both parties are alive to embody it. Corpses make unsatisfying enemies." Kedrick tried to laugh and managed only a cough that sent fresh pain through his chest. Outside, rain continued its steady percussion against stone walls that had weathered worse storms than whatever political situation currently existed between Ravencourt and Ashford interests. "What do you want, Serafina?" "Genuinely. If you could have any resolution to this situation, what would satisfy the debt you came here to collect?" She was silent for long enough that Kedrick thought she might not answer. Then she spoke quietly, her voice carrying something more honest than the hatred she had projected during their combat. "I want my family back. I want 15 years of my life returned. I want to stop waking up every morning, remembering how my father's blood looked on the feast hall floors." She met his gaze. "But I cannot have any of that. So instead I came here demanding your death because at least that would mean someone paid for what happened. That the universe acknowledged the injustice even if it could not correct it. And now I am sitting in the chambers of a man I tried to kill, watching him struggle to breathe because of wounds I inflicted, and discovering that revenge does not actually heal anything. It just adds more bodies to the pile while the original grief remains exactly as sharp as before." The admission hung between them like physical presence. Kaedric had spent 3 days unconscious, but Serafina had spent them awake, sitting beside someone she hated while ensuring he survived long enough to continue a conversation neither of them knew how to finish. That was not justice or revenge. That was something far more complicated and human. "My father was a monster," Kaedric said carefully. Each word required effort, but they needed to be said. "Everything you believed about him was probably true and worse. He ruled through cruelty, eliminated threats real and imagined, and left a legacy of violence that I spent 15 years trying to manage while pretending I was different." "You were different." Serafina's voice was flat. "You were efficient about your brutality. That is not the same as being better." "No, probably not." Kaedric shifted slightly despite the pain, needing to see her face more clearly. "But I'm trying to understand what you actually want from me now." "Death clearly, but you could have taken that while I was unconscious. So what else? What resolution exists that lets both of us walk away from inherited hatred without just creating the next generation's version of the same conflict?" "I do not know." The confession came out reluctant. "I spent years planning revenge, learning to fight, rebuilding Ravencourt resources in secret, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And I never actually thought past the moment of your death. Never considered what came after except vague sense that justice would feel satisfying." "Does it feel satisfying?" Serafina looked at her hands, still stained with blood that had not fully washed away despite 3 days of tending wounds. "No, it feels hollow. Like I discovered that the thing I wanted most would not actually fix anything broken inside me." The rain picked up force, drumming harder against windows. Somewhere in the fortress, people were continuing daily routines despite the political situation hovering unresolved above them. Guards changing shifts, servants preparing meals. The machinery of governance continuing regardless of whether anyone actually governed. Kaedric closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling at him despite having been unconscious for days. His body needed more rest, but his mind needed to finish this conversation before unconsciousness claimed him again. "I am leaving Thorngate," he said. "The abdication papers are signed. Elena's networks are already implementing transition to council governance. So your revenge becomes academic because the man you wanted to punish is walking away from everything your father died trying to protect people from. That is not justice. No. That is just pragmatic elimination of a problem everyone agreed needed solving." Kadrick opened his eyes and found her staring at him with expression he could not quite read. "But it creates opportunity. If I am gone and you are here with an army, nothing stops Ravencourt from reclaiming northern territories that were stolen 15 years ago. Except, I do not want to rule through force." Serafina stood abruptly and moved to the window again, her back to him. "I wanted justice for my family, not to become the next brutal lord who holds power because they were willing to kill for it. That is just repeating the cycle." Then we have similar problem. Both of us inheriting situations we did not create, and discovering that the solutions available all look like versions of the violence that started this. "So what do you propose?" She turned to face him. "You abdicate. I reclaim my family's territories through might, and we both pretend that resolves historical injustice while actually just shuffling which family holds the knife. Or," Kedrick pushed through pain to speak clearly, "you join Elena's council, bring Ravencourt legitimacy to the governing structure. Use your claim to northern territories as foundation for authority rather than weapon for revenge. And we both accept that perfect justice is impossible, but maybe functional compromise is better than continued bloodshed." "Why would you suggest that?" Her voice carried suspicion. "What benefit do you gain from elevating Ravencourt authority?" "None." "Which is exactly why it might actually work." Kadrick's laugh came out as wheeze. "I am done playing political games, Serafina, done calculating advantage, done pretending that ruling through fear creates anything except more fear. If putting your family back in power helps break that cycle, then at least my abdication serves purpose beyond just removing a problem. And where does that leave you? Alive, apparently, which is more than I expected 3 days ago." Kadrick felt consciousness starting to slip again, exhaustion and medication pulling him toward darkness. "Beyond that, I genuinely have no idea, but I am done being Duke of Thorngate, done being my father's legacy. If I survive recovery, I will disappear into whatever life exists for people who spent 15 years being monsters and are trying to figure out if transformation is possible." Serafina studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly, some internal decision made. "Rest, Duke Ashford. We will continue this conversation when you are not actively dying from wounds I gave you." She left before he could respond. Kadrick sank back into unconsciousness with the sound of rain and the lingering question of what came after revenge when both parties decided that satisfaction was not actually available. Recovery took 2 weeks that felt like 2 years. Kedrick's body healed slowly, infection and blood loss having taken him closer to death than anyone was comfortable acknowledging. Serafina visited daily, her presence shifting from hostile observation to something approaching cautious alliance, as they continued negotiating terms for resolution that served neither of their original purposes. Brennan managed the fortress during Kaedric's convalescence, maintaining the truce with Ravencourt forces while coordinating with Elena's representatives about transitional governance. The captain's reports painted a picture of barely controlled chaos, multiple factions trying to establish authority, while the actual Duke was too wounded to enforce anything. On the 10th day, Kaedric was finally strong enough to walk unassisted to his study. The room looked exactly as he had left it before trial by combat, documents still scattered, evidence of Marcus's assassination attempt still visible in displaced furniture and bloodstains that had not fully cleaned from stone floors. He stood at the window overlooking courtyards where he had nearly died and wondered what person he was supposed to become now that the role he had inhabited for 15 years was officially ended. Elena arrived that afternoon with contracts and questions. She entered the study without knocking, her expression suggesting she had reached the limits of patience with political situations that refused to resolve cleanly. "Duke Ashford, you look substantially less dead than reports suggested. Medical intervention has that effect." Kaedric gestured to chairs near the fireplace. "I assume you are here to finalize transition details, among other complications." Elena sat with the exhaustion of someone who had been managing crisis for weeks. Serafina Ravencourt has indicated interest in joining the governing council. She claims historical right to northern territories, and wants formal recognition of Ravencourt claims as part of transitional agreement. And you object because it creates precedent that any family with historical grievance can demand territorial restoration. Elena pulled documents from her case. Half the kingdom has inherited land disputes going back generations. If we acknowledge Ravencourt's claim, we open floodgates to reconstruction of every border that ever existed. Or you acknowledge that my father committed crimes worth correcting and build governance structure that includes voices historically silenced. Kadrick moved to the desk where his own abdication papers lay waiting for final signatures. Serafina has legitimate grievance and actual military force. Excluding her from the council just guarantees future conflict when you are trying to establish stable transition. This is not what we agreed to. Elena's voice carried frustration. You were supposed to walk away quietly. Instead, you nearly died in trial by combat. Created alliance with the woman who came here to kill you, and are now advocating for complete restructuring of northern governance. Plans change when you discover your father was running slave operations and murdered people who tried to expose him. Kedrick signed the abdication documents with firm strokes. I am still leaving, but I am not leaving Thorngate to governance structure that ignores legitimate claims just because they complicate your political convenience. And if the council refuses to seat Ravencourt representatives, then Serafina has 300 soldiers currently camped outside these walls, and personal motivation to ensure her family's restoration happens with or without bureaucratic approval. Kedrick set down the pen. Your choice, Elena. Negotiate terms that give everyone stake and stability, or watch the northern territories descend into civil conflict the moment I am gone. Elena stared at him with expressions suggesting she was reconsidering whether keeping him alive had been a wise decision. You have become remarkably principled for someone who spent 15 years ruling through fear. I have had time to reconsider my approach while recovering from wounds inflicted by someone whose father I indirectly benefited from murdering. Kedrick returned to his chair near the fire. Tends to provide perspective on whether the methods I used were actually necessary or just easier than alternatives requiring moral courage. The words hung between them. Finally, Elena gathered her documents and stood. I will present Ravencourt inclusion to the council, but this creates complications you may not have considered. If Serafina joins governance, she becomes stakeholder in maintaining order rather than revolutionary seeking to overturn it. That changes her utility to our networks. Good. Maybe that is exactly what both Thorngate and Ravencourt need. Leadership that has incentive for stability rather than continued conflict. Kadrick watched rain begin again outside the windows. And maybe I need to see that something better than what I built can actually function before I disappear into wherever former tyrants go to contemplate their failures. Elena departed with promises to return once council negotiations reached resolution. Kedrick sat alone in his study and felt the weight of 15 years slowly lifting, not disappeared, just shifting from active burden to historical fact that would exist whether he continued carrying it or not. The final agreement took 3 more days of negotiation that Kedrick observed, but did not participate in directly. His role was officially ended the moment he signed abdication papers. What remained was just witnessing the dismantling of everything he had built, and hoping that whatever replaced it would be marginally less brutal. The council's structures included 7 seats, 3 from Elena's regional networks, 2 from existing Thorngate administration, and 2 from Ravencourt restoration interests, including Serafina herself. It was unwieldy and probably unstable, but it gave everyone enough stake that destroying the arrangement meant losing their own authority. Compromise through mutually assured political inconvenience. Not inspiring, but functional. On the day the council formally convened, Kedrick attended only long enough to witness Serafina's official recognition as Lady of the Northern. Territories with full restoration of Ravencourt claims to land seized during his father's governance. She stood before the assembled council and accepted appointment with grace that suggested she understood this was not victory, so much as opportunity to prove her family could govern without becoming the next generation's version of Ashford brutality. Their eyes met across the hall. Some unspoken acknowledgement passed between them, recognition that they had both survived something neither had expected and were now responsible for ensuring it meant something beyond just personal survival. After the ceremony, Brennan found Kedrick in his chambers packing the few possessions he planned to take into whatever came next. Where will you go, Your Grace? Kedrick folded a shirt with more care than necessary. Somewhere no one knows my name or what I did to earn it. Maybe the coastal provinces. Maybe further. The geography matters less than the anonymity. And what will you do there? I have no idea. The admission felt liberating and terrifying simultaneously. I have spent my entire adult life being Duke of Thorngate. I do not know what I am without the title and the territory and the constant threat assessment. You are the man who survived your father's legacy without becoming him completely. Brennan moved to help with packing. That has to count for something. Does it? Kadrick set down the shirt. I ruled through fear, destroyed anyone who threatened my authority, and created fortress where people were terrified of their own lord. The fact that I was marginally less sadistic than my father seems like low bar for redemption. You also kept roads safe, eliminated corruption, and maintained stability that let people sleep without fear of bandits or starvation. The captain's voice was firm. You were brutal, but you were also effective. That matters even if the cost was higher than it should have been. Marcus did not think so. Tried to kill me for it. Marcus spent 40 years enabling your governance and then tried to absolve his own guilt by eliminating you. Brennan closed the packed bag with decisive motion. Do not mistake his crisis of conscience for accurate moral assessment of your entire reign. The defense was unexpected and probably undeserved, but Kaedric appreciated it nonetheless. Brennan had served faithfully through methods that must have tested his own principles repeatedly. If he could find something worth defending in Kaedric's governance, maybe it was not entirely wasted years. Take care of them, Kaedric said quietly. The people here. Make sure the council does not make things worse while trying to make them better. I will do my best. Brennan extended his hand. It has been an honor serving under your command, Your Grace, even when I disagreed with your methods. They shook hands, the grip firm and brief. A transaction of respect between men who understood that loyalty and approval were different things. Kedrick left Thorngate at dawn the next day with a single horse and enough gold to live comfortably for years if he was careful. No ceremony, no formal goodbye beyond what had already been said. Just a man riding through gates that had defined his identity for 15 years and discovering that the world beyond was simultaneously terrifying and oddly peaceful in its lack of constant threat assessment. He stopped once at the edge of his former territories and looked back at Thorngate rising from cliffs above the sea. The fortress looked exactly as it had when he inherited it. Stone walls weathered by time, banners streaming in wind, permanent and implacable. Everything inside those walls would change now. New governance, new methods, new leaders who would make their own mistakes while trying to improve on his legacy. But the walls themselves would remain, outlasting everyone currently fighting over what happened within them. There was something oddly comforting in that impermanence. The recognition that power was temporary, legacy was negotiable, and the only thing that actually persisted was the land itself, and the people who continued surviving regardless of who claimed authority over them. Kaedric turned his horse toward the coast and rode away from everything he had been. 6 months passed in quiet anonymity that felt nothing like the constant calculation of governance. Kedrick settled in a coastal city far enough from northern territories that his face meant nothing and his name was just sounds without historical weight. He took a small room near the harbor, spent his days working manual labor on the docks, and discovered that exhaustion from physical work felt fundamentally different than exhaustion from political maneuvering. No one tried to kill him, no one plotted against him, no one needed his decisions about justice or resource allocation or whether specific threats required elimination. It should have been peaceful. Instead, it felt like slowly suffocating in comfort, each day blending into the next without purpose or meaning beyond simple survival. He had spent 15 years being someone who mattered, whose choices affected thousands of lives for better or worse. Now he was just another dock worker hauling cargo and collecting modest wages that barely covered rent and food. The emptiness was profound. He began drinking more than was wise, sitting alone in harbor taverns while trying to understand what person he was supposed to become now that the monster had been decommissioned. The alcohol did not provide answers, but it made the questions feel less urgent for brief periods. On a night when rain hammered the harbor and most sensible people stayed inside, Kedrick sat in his usual corner of a tavern that catered to laborers and sailors who asked no questions about anyone's history. He was 3 drinks past sober when someone sat down across from him uninvited. Seraphina Ravencourt looked out of place in the rough establishment, her presence drawing attention despite obvious attempts at anonymity. She wore travel clothes that had seen actual use, and her face showed the kind of controlled exhaustion that came from governance rather than combat. Lady Ravencourt, Kedrick's voice came out rougher than intended. This is either remarkable coincidence or you have been tracking me. The latter. She signaled for her own drink. Finding you was not difficult once I dedicated resources to it. Former Duke with distinctive appearance suddenly disappearing creates patterns worth following. And you followed them why? Come to finish what we started in the courtyard. No. I came because the council is falling apart, and I need advice from someone who actually knows how to govern these territories. The admission landed like physical impact. Kedrick set down his glass carefully. You want governance advice from the tyrant you tried to kill for governing too brutally. The irony is notable. The irony is that I spent 6 months discovering that ruling justly is significantly harder than ruling effectively. Serafina accepted her drink from the tavern keeper. The council cannot make decisions without endless debate. Corruption is returning because no one wants to be seen as brutal when enforcing consequences. Crime is increasing because criminals understand the new leadership fears being compared to you. So you want me to come back and restore order through intimidation. I want you to help me understand how to maintain stability without becoming what you were. Her voice dropped. I wanted justice for my family. I got restoration and authority. And now I am learning that having power and knowing what to do with it are entirely different problems. Kedrick studied her face, seeing the same exhaustion he felt reflected in someone else's struggle with impossible situations. She had won everything she came for and discovered that victory tasted like ash when served with actual responsibility. What specifically is failing? He asked, despite himself. Everything that requires difficult choices. Serafina pulled documents from her coat. Bandits are raiding again because we cannot agree on appropriate response. Tax collection is inconsistent because regional interests prioritize their own territories. Border disputes are escalating because no one wants to establish precedent for how we handle them. The stability you maintain through fear is collapsing because we built council structure on principle that gentle governance would somehow magically work. And you discovered that gentle governance requires the same difficult choices, just with prettier language. Yes. She met his gaze directly. So I am here asking if you learned anything during 6 months of self-imposed exile. If stepping away from power gave you perspective on how to wield it without becoming monster in the process. Kedrick laughed, bitter and harsh. I learned that I have no idea who I am without the role I spent 15 years inhabiting. That every skill I developed was optimized for maintaining authority through fear. That removing me from governance was correct decision, but it left me with nothing except awareness of my own fundamental uselessness. That is not true. No. Probably not. But it feels true. And feelings matter when you are trying to build new identity from ruins of the old one. He finished his drink. I cannot help you, Serafina. Everything I know about governance involves methods you specifically rejected as too brutal. Teaching you those methods defeats the purpose of removing me in the first place. I am not asking you to teach me brutality. Her voice was firm now. I am asking if you learned anything about balance, about maintaining order without sacrificing humanity, about whether it is possible to be effective without being feared. Kedrick was silent for a long time, the question cutting deeper than she probably intended. He had spent 6 months avoiding exactly that inquiry, filling days with meaningless labor specifically so he would not have to confront whether transformation was actually possible or if he was just broken tool waiting to rust. But sitting across from Serafina, watching her struggle with the same impossible balance he had failed to achieve, something shifted. Not redemption exactly, just recognition that maybe his failure could serve purpose by preventing hers. The answer is, I do not know, he finally said. But I think the question itself might be wrong. You're asking if you can maintain stability without being feared. Better question might be whether you can be feared for the right reasons instead of arbitrary ones. Explain. People feared me because I was unpredictable in my brutality, because they never knew which action would trigger consequences. That is terror, not respect. Kedrick leaned forward. But what if they feared you because you were absolutely consistent, because they understood exactly what behaviors had consequences, and those consequences were applied uniformly regardless of status or connection? That is still fear, yes. But it is fear of justice rather than fear of tyrant. There is difference. One creates paralysis. The other creates clarity about acceptable behavior. Kedrick pulled the documents toward him and scanned them. Your bandit problem exists because criminals do not believe the council will actually punish them. Your corruption problem exists because officials think connections will protect them. Your border disputes escalate because no one believes the council has will to enforce difficult decisions. So I should start executing people. You should start making clear that actions have consequences, and those consequences will be applied consistently. Execution, exile, property seizure, whatever fits the crime. But applied uniformly and predictably so people understand that the governance structure has actual teeth. That sounds like everything you did. The difference is, I made consequences arbitrary and overwhelming to maintain personal power. You make them proportional and consistent to maintain rule of law. Kedrick pushed the documents back. Same tools, different purpose. One creates tyranny, the other creates justice that people might actually respect. Serafina studied him across the table. If I do this, if I start governing with the kind of certainty you are describing, will you help? No. Kedrick stood, the alcohol and exhaustion making him unsteady. I am done being part of governance. But I will tell you this, the fact that you came here asking means you already understand what is necessary. You just wanted permission from someone who failed at the same balance. So consider this permission, govern firmly, make hard decisions, and do not let fear of becoming me prevent you from being effective. He left the tavern before she could respond, walking out into rain that had not let up since sunset. Behind him, he could feel her watching through the window, calculating whether his advice was worth following or just another monster justifying their methods. He hoped she chose better than he had, but that was no longer his responsibility. 3 more months passed before Kedrick received word about Northern Territories. The letter arrived through channels he had not known still existed, delivered by a rider who found him at the docks and left before Kedrick could ask questions. The message was brief but significant. Stability restored. Council functioning under reformed structure. Ravencourt governance proving effective without resorting to tyranny. Thought you might want to know your advice worked. Thank you. It was not signed, but Kedrick recognized Serafina's handwriting from the document she had shown him in the tavern. He stood on the docks, holding the letter and feeling something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Not quite redemption. More like recognition that maybe his failure had prevented someone else's. That the hard lessons learned through 15 years of brutal governance had translated into advice that helped create something better than what he had built. It was not forgiveness for what he had done, not absolution for the people who had suffered under his rule, but it was acknowledgement that even broken tools could sometimes be repurposed into something useful if the right person found them at the right time. That night, Kedrick sat in his small room and wrote his own letter, not to Serafina but to himself, an accounting of everything he had learned through failure and exile and watching someone else succeed where he had not. Power without humanity creates only fear. Fear without justice creates only hatred. And hatred without resolution creates only the next generation's version of the same violence. He had been the fear. Marcus had been the hatred. Serafina was trying to be the resolution. And maybe that was as close to meaningful legacy as someone like him could hope to achieve. Not redemption through grand gesture, but usefulness through hard-won understanding passed to someone still capable of better choices. Kedrick folded the letter and placed it in the small box where he kept the few items that still mattered. His father's ring, which he had never worn. The abdication papers, which marked the end of one identity. And now this letter, which marked the beginning of understanding that transformation was not about becoming someone new, but about making peace with who you had been while trying to cause less damage going forward. Outside, harbor bells rang midnight. Inside, a former duke sat alone and felt something close to peace for the first time since inheriting a fortress and a legacy 15 years ago. It was not happiness, not satisfaction. Just quiet acceptance that some people were meant to be cautionary tales rather than heroes, that their purpose was to demonstrate what not to do clearly enough that others could find better paths. And if that was his legacy, if the sum of 15 years' brutal governance was wisdom that helped someone else govern more justly, then maybe all of it had been necessary after all. Not for his own sake, but for the people who would come after and learn from his failures what success might actually look like. Kedrick extinguished his lamp and lay down to sleep without nightmares for the first time in months. Tomorrow he would return to the docks, would haul cargo and collect wages and continue living an anonymous life far from territories he once ruled. But tonight he could rest knowing that somewhere in the north, someone was building something better on the ruins of everything he had destroyed. And that was enough. Not redemption, not forgiveness, just enough. The rain continued through the night, washing everything clean in the way that only storms could. And when dawn arrived, it found a man who had finally learned that sometimes the bravest thing a monster could do was walk away and let the humans try to build something worth surviving. Cedric Ashford, Duke of Nothing, woke to sunlight on water and the distant sound of harbor life continuing without need for his decisions or his governance or his particular brand of brutal efficiency. He dressed and went to work. And for the first time in 15 years, that felt like exactly enough purpose to carry him through one more day.